Okay. Welcome, everyone. I think we're ready to go. Thank you all. Welcome to the first session in the panel breakout room at the Soybean Summit. I hope you're in the right place. My name is Abigail Peterson. I am a certified crop advisor and the director of agronomy for the Illinois Soybean Association. Before I introduce today's panel, I'd like to thank the session sponsor, the Soil Water Outcomes Fund. Clayton, do you want to say a few words?
Hey everybody, my name is Clayton Sessions. I am the Illinois Field Program Representative for the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund. We are a wholly owned subsidiary of the Iowa Soybean Association, and we are committed to connecting financial opportunities to farmers who are implementing new or additional conservation practices to their farms. We specifically work in Scope 3 insetting, working with our partners in Illinois, such as like PepsiCo and Ingredion, companies that are trying to lower their greenhouse gas footprint within their supply chain. So over the past several years, we've been able to enroll over 500,000 acres, covering 13 states. Last year, we had an average payment going to the farmer of $33 an acre. A few things that set us, kind of highlight our program a little bit is the fact that we have one-year contracts, no long-term commitments on your fields. Those contracts are actually given, an estimate is given to you prior to any kind of signing, so you actually know what you're going to be receiving before any kind of contractual binding. The payments themselves come in two different times, so you'll get 50% shortly after you enroll, and then the other 50% will come at the end of the crop season after field verification. And no acre minimums or maximums, nothing like that. It's designed to scale at each individual farmer's rate. So thank you and enjoy.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Clayton. Clayton will be around for you guys to talk with afterwards if you'd like. So I am not going to read my script because the bios are in the booklet that you have, and I don't want to waste time. I'll just say from the panel this morning, questions were asked about voles, plantability, different things when adjusting to cover crop systems. So I highly encourage you to take advantage of this time with two experts in the field that I've seen a lot and know a lot from the research that they've seen and conducted themselves. So I'm going to start and kick it off to Dan, and then Jim will follow. And then if you have any burning questions during their talk, please ask. But at the end of the presentation, we'll open it up for questions.
Thanks, Abigail. Before I get started, there's some acknowledgments I want to do in the room. People that have affected my thinking over the last 12 years on cover crops, nitrogen management, and those kind of things. Lowell Gentry, raise your hand. John Pike. Eric Miller, are you in here? He must have went to another session. But those three guys have changed the thought process in how I view nutrient management and nutrient loss and cover crops. So you're probably wondering, what's a fertilizer guy doing in a cover crop talk? Well, sometimes I'll say that it's penance for all the things that I did wrong since I started in the fertilizer business back in 1973. So I'm one of the 70-year-olds that they were talking about this morning. So when you talk about changing your philosophy, changing what you think, Lowell and I were bumping heads just as far back as 2011 and 2012. I was arguing the fact that nitrogen loss from fall applications was not a big deal. I was arguing that a cover crop only caused additional headaches for the grower and didn't supply the nutrient loss removal that we needed. So once I got involved with these guys and got into the research, all of a sudden I'm going like, I spent 30 years in the retail fertilizer business doing a lot of things wrong. One of my biggest sins, and I'll bring this up, is spreading on frozen, snow-covered soil. And with the help of Lowell, who's got 31 years of tracking the Embraer watershed, the river at Camargo, Illinois, we pulled samples from fields that were spread, and we had runoff in some December, January time frames, and we tracked what was in, because this was in the watershed, we tracked phosphorus loss all the way back down to Camargo. And we had numbers from the field, and we had numbers from the spikes in the river. That will wake you up, and that will make you open your eyes up to nutrient loss. we've got some target dates. So 2025 is coming up pretty quick, right? Could we hit that field by field on field by field basis? Just simply put cereal rye after corn ahead of soybeans, and you've got it. The 45% for nitrogen by 2035. If we work together, we can hit that. It's just a matter of getting the correct nitrogen rate, getting the correct timing of nitrogen, and adding a cover crop every other year ahead of soybeans after corn. And I'm going to show you some data from Lowell's recent paper as we get through this. Waterways. What happened to waterways? I mean, you don't see very many of them out there in my area, which is Champaign County. This is from Champaign County. This was a soil loss that ended up in the Embrol. The farmer across the road, his waterway got silted in, and this is a continuous problem in this field. You could go there today and see the same thing. How they fix that each year, this is a cash rented field, how they fix that each year is to go into the field cultivator and level it. That was the same event in the same time frame. That field was spread with fertilizer the first week of March in 2019. We got an inch of rain on frozen ground, and that's where we captured the phosphorus loss that ended up in the Embrol. So it's real. I mean, I wouldn't have believed it. I can't tell you how many times we were spreading fertilizer the last 2 weeks of December back when I was in the business. And we were spreading on, you have enough trouble trying to even get into the field because of snow drifts, and we were spreading. Do we need to chisel bean stubble? I've heard the excuses. Compaction. A lot of bean stubble got chiseled this past fall. There wasn't any compaction. We had a dry fall, but we're still chisel plowing bean stubble. Just for fun, Eric Miller took that picture of me. I don't know if you can see it or not, but I'm about 6 foot tall, and that's the sunflower ripper that's being used in the fields. I don't know if we really need that. Somebody was talking about the economics of going to strip till. If you want to put a knife in the ground, you can buy a strip till bar and put a knife in the ground and only till 15 inches or 10 inches or whatever, and probably not have much more money in it than what you've got right there. Cereal rye after corn before soybeans. Biomass, 1.1 ton, 26 pounds of N in the biomass. Carbon to nitrogen ratio is 34.1. But that's what a cover crop would look like. You kind of see it, it's kind of yellow. Well, that's because in the research that we do, we try to stay with the MRTN nitrogen rate, and by the time you raise a 250 bushel corn crop, you've depleted the nitrogen, and the cereal rye is barely able to pull any out. So you got 26 pounds of N that's pulled out of that. And that's the size of the cover crop about when we would terminate. You pulled up the nitrogen that was going down the tile, and we'll show you some tile results from some of his research. Just recently published, split fertilizer nitrogen applications with cereal rye cover crop reduces tile nitrate loads in corn soybean rotation. Lowell just got this published, very good piece. We've sent out some press releases. We're sending out some bullet points on this paper. First year, cereal rye after corn, that's where the cereal rye was. You can see the 40% reduction in tile nitrate loads from that cereal rye. Very good, and that was approximately a 1 ton biomass. Highlights from the replicated drainage tile study in Douglas County. Splitting fall in did not significantly increase corn yields or decrease tile nitrates. So we did 100 pounds of N in the fall. We still had high nitrate losses from the fall application as compared to the other treatments. Tile nitrate loss is greater with the fall applied N versus spring applied. Of the total N loss, about 64% was in the corn, 36% in the soybeans. The spring pre-plant, 75% rate of the MRTN reduced the yield by about 8%, but it didn't really reduce the tile nitrates when you compared a spring split and side dress application in the spring with the full rate of MRTN rate. So the reduced rate reduced our yields, but it didn't really reduce the tile nitrate load when it was compared to the full MRTN. The 75% N rate lost the same amount of tile nitrate as the spring 50-50 N application of the full MRTN rate. In fall, lost about 7% of the N rate lost about, or accounted for about 38% of the tile nitrate load. So we're not losing that much, but we're still loading the tile. It's a large part of that nitrate. Going the wrong way. So from this same study that's in the paper that Lowell wrote, 1.5 tons of above ground biomass can reduce tile nitrates by 45%. I just showed you we got to have a 45% reduction by 2035. By the way, I'm retiring in 2034 because that's how optimistic I am. CRI ahead of soybeans every other year. Did you hear that? Every other year. In corn soybean rotation, reduce tile nitrates by 33% in the soybean year and approximately 13% in the corn phase. You don't need a cover crop every year. We saw it at Tuscola in an every other year system. So we didn't have cover crops. Actually, the cover crops failed ahead of the corn. So in these strips, it was just the cereal rye ahead of the soybeans doing the heavy lifting. Now, if you're going to go in and rip up the bean stubble after that, you're probably not going to see the same benefits. Moving fall into spring and growing a cereal rye every other year ahead of soybeans can achieve an overall goal of 45%. So taking those findings from that project, we're looking to go into a larger scale watershed, one that's connected with the Embrawl down there, the Black Slough, which is just outside of Philo, Illinois. The only thing those guys do in that watershed is fall ammonia and till everything up, and there's hardly any cover crops. So it's going to be a learning experience for them, and I've actually got the mayor of Philo that's going to help me work on that project. So that nested, oh, come on. I'm not very good with my left hand. So that nested watershed in the Embrawl, it's already got monitors already placed, and we're pretty sure from the 31 years of data they have at Camargo that we can affect even the larger part of that watershed, because this is going to be about a 7,000 acre watershed we're going to take a look at and see, and I talk about this in some other talks, we can flip this in 1 year. We can make that change. When you look at that graph of what cereal rye did in that field, we can flip that. Everybody should try this in one of their fields and see if they can make that change. So field by field is how we're probably going to make the nutrient loss reduction goal. Benefits of cover crops: decrease soil erosion, add organic matter, feed microbes, suppress weeds, and catch crop. I'm more worried about the end catch crop. That's what I want to see us do. We don't have to plant green. We don't have to have biomass up to my shoulders. But if we get about 8 to 15 inches of cover crop, we can catch the nitrogen's leaving. Another tillage, another trial we've got going at Eric Miller's farm is tillage treatments. We're looking at conventional, no-till, strip-till, and strip-till with cover crops. So everybody says I heard this morning that there may be a yield lag with no-till or strip-till versus conventional. This is conventional tillage. That's a 21 corn crop, 22 soybean crop, 23 corn crop. If you look at the no-till, strip-till with cover crops, there is no difference. I don't even have to do the statistics on that and see there's no difference. So it's not a scary thing to make that move. In 21, we had 23.9 pounds of N, 22, 16.4, and 23, 12.2. Depending on how well the cover crop establishes is what signifies how much we're going to get. That's the strips. That's the termination from where the strips were made in the fall, and this is winter barley ahead of corn. We always go winter barley or wheat ahead of corn, and the cereal rye ahead of soybeans. So it only takes about a half ton of biomass, and we saw nitrate reduction. Corn coming up in a strip, not much competition there. This is the line of, this is the 4 treatments, the average of 4 replications of the strip till with cover crop, and you can see how far down it does pull the nitrates out of the tile. So we've got that going on. We've seen it in research. It's there. 1.5 tons of biomass going to give us about 45% reduction in tile nitrate loss, and that's at a 1.5 ton rate. You can see where the lines intersect. And that's my story. You can give me a call, but our complaints have really dropped here recently, so you may have to keep calling.
All right, so I'm Jim Isermann. I'll be the second panelist for today. As you can see in kind of the bio that I think is provided, some background on myself, working with some of the programs throughout the state of Illinois. My biggest role is working with the PCM program through Illinois Corn and Illinois Soybean. Within that PCM program, they have what's called the 5-year transition program. It's kind of a subset of the PCM program where we're working with farmers to adopt cover crops and soil health systems. But there's also a research component to that system as well. So in addition to just working with the farmers over a 5-year period, helping them to kind of understand the ins and outs of adopting these practices, there's also some soil sampling that takes place, and there's a comparison involved with that. So farmers are enrolling usually an 80-acre field, and they're splitting it in half, doing 40 acres of cover crops and 40 acres of their standard treatment. Oftentimes we're seeing farmers doing just no-till or strip-till systems and then adding a cover crops, but we do have some trials that are looking at full-out conventional tillage compared to adopting a cover crop and no-till. So a lot of diversity there in that program. I think we had over 60 trials or 60 sites apply cover crops this last fall. Done that for a number of years. Also working some with Illinois Soybean Association and the trial network that they talked about earlier, doing some comparison trials. So what I'm going to talk when I'm talking about what I'm seeing throughout the state, I just want to give you a little bit of that background of where that's coming from, working with these farmers who are doing these comparison trials, working with them enough that we're having those conversations about management. We're understanding what their herbicide programs are, what their tillage programs are, and ultimately what the yield is. We collect that yield evaluation at the end of the year using yield monitor data and making those comparisons to see exactly what kind of an effect is in yield. And then the other key component is the agronomics of that. We talk a lot about the benefits of cover crops and the water quality or soil health, but just the basic reality that we're trying to raise corn and soybean crops as well. And when we're throwing this living plant out there, in addition to the corn and soybeans, there's a lot of agronomic implications to that. So that's a lot of what we try to work with, trying to understand that. So when we get down to the idea if we're losing yield or if we're not losing yield, whatever that answer is, what exactly is going on? What can we do to improve the system, to make it better, and to avoid any potential issues and try to get just the benefits out of cover crops? So looking back on the 2023 year, just to give you some highlights of what I saw, I think first and foremost, the thing that impressed me most was so many farmers starting to learn the system a lot better. Been doing this for a number of years, kind of in the professional space and just talking with farmers. And I think as those of us in the industry are out there, sometimes we feel like things aren't moving very fast or we're not getting anywhere with cover crop adoption or soil health. But for some reason this last year, I just kind of felt like I started to see a lot more movement, at least in the mentality or the knowledge base of farmers, starting to have the conversations, not having to start from scratch with so many of them to talk through how carbon to nitrogen ratios or how nutrient management works, and being able to talk more about some of those advanced concepts. See that as well as with the advisors and the people out there working with the farmers. So I think that's very promising that we're kind of getting past that first hump in that knowledge, and people are starting to really understand more about the system. And I think that kind of started off in the springtime when we started off pretty dry. I mean, we kind of had a standard spring early on. We had good moisture, but then right away we started hearing the reports, especially on the cover crop side of guys, the cover crops taking out the moisture, and then we had some issues with germination with the cover crops afterwards. I was afraid that was going to be a bigger deal than it turned out to be, at least from my perspective. I mean, if that was a problem for you, it was a big deal. There's no way around it. But talking with a lot of farmers, a lot of guys were looking at that system and had terminated earlier, both because they saw the weather reports, both because they were starting to have that concern, also because they're just learning more that those early terminations can be more beneficial because of some of the data coming off from even the work that like Dan has done and others are starting to show that we don't necessarily need 5 or 6 foot tall cereal rye, that 18 to 24 inch tall cereal rye can give us a lot of those benefits. So what I was afraid was going to be a much larger issue wasn't quite as big of an issue just because we saw a lot of farmers doing some of those earlier terminations. In addition, we've seen a lot more differences in terms of the cover crops being used. You know, again, Dan talking about not just cereal rye, using things like barley, wheat, triticale. We've even seen some more brassica start to come in and be used more often. And I think that's really starting to help us out too. Guys are starting to understand cereal rye ahead of corn is not a great idea. I understand some of you guys may be on some highly erodible ground. Some of you guys are in southern Illinois. It may work out for you a little bit better to use cereal rye in those instances. But generally speaking, you know, cereal rye ahead of corn has been probably one of the biggest headaches and the source of most of the issues that we've had in terms of yield reductions with cover crops. So that message is starting to get through. We're seeing fewer and fewer people taking that on as their first steps with cover crops. So those types of messages, and then even when they are doing that, they're actually using the proper nitrogen management. So guys looking at things such as barley or wheat or triticale ahead of corn, if they have to go to those cereal cover crops, guys also setting up their system in order to not have to rely on those cereal cover crops ahead of corn, or again, to Dan's point, just not worrying about a cover crop ahead of corn if you're in your early years of the system, right? Just get that cover crop ahead of soybeans, work on that nutrient management, work on conservation tillage ahead of corn, look at strip tilling. So again, seeing those messages come through has been very promising for me. It being a dry year with a lot of the yield data that we've seen come through, and hopefully we'll have some better reports come out on what that looks like, but definitely the mature systems are showing some good promises on the yield side of things. I think we've traditionally talked about a 3 to 5 year transition for soils in order to kind of get over those early concerns about no-till or cover crops and potential yield reductions. As we've seen, they don't always have to be yield reductions. We can, with the right management, we can start to see some positives a lot earlier. That window of 3 to 5 years, from what I'm seeing, maybe needs to be a little bit longer in some instances, but we do definitely kind of get past that phase where we start to see those benefits. And in a year like this year, I think when we look back, we're going to start to see some good benefits as a result of those soil health systems. Not necessarily from cover crops. Some of it is also just from the fact that we're in a no-till system. You know, there's a lot of good benefits from being in those no-till and reduced till systems. So we need to not ignore that aspect and just always jump straight to the cover crops. The no-till is a big component of that. So the different species, I think the applications, this is probably the second fall in a row that I've seen really good aerial applications. I know a lot of farmers have really gotten away from using aerial applications. You know, kind of depends which region you're in or where you're at. But I think that's also a testament to the experience and the knowledge. They're starting to learn when you can use an aerial application and get the benefit. It isn't something that you can necessarily do every year without thinking about it. They're knowing when to pull the trigger on it, when to go after in the right crop stages and everything. And that's opening up that world of other species, right? We want to get beyond just cereal rye. We heard the comment earlier today. When I heard that cereal rye wasn't a great cover crop, at first I was kind of up in arms about it. And then after that, I'm thinking, well, you know, it's not necessarily a great cover crop. It's just a cover crop we can use, right, in our corn and soybean systems. By the time we limit ourselves to when we can get out there, when we can get the crop seeded, the herbicides that we use in our programs that can come back to hurt a lot of the other species, cereal rye just kind of ends up being what we can use. So we're using it quite often simply because it's the cover crop that works. So seeing farmers start to diversify and start looking at those different application methods, aerial application, and then even after harvest, just big differences in increase in getting across acres. Guys maybe getting away from the drills quite so much and starting to look at the vertical tillage tools with the broadcasters, even just some guys broadcasting on the soil surface. Again, those things are starting to kind of take off a little bit as we realize, you know, maybe an 80% stand on 10 times as many acres might be worthwhile, right? We talk about the drill being the gold standard, getting out there and you get that perfect stand, and that can be great. You're not going to see that with a broadcast application, but if you get across, you know, 10 times as much ground, maybe we can get a lot more benefit out of that by doing those types of applications. So looking back at the year, I think that was kind of the biggest highlights and what had impressed me the most about the year and kind of gave me the optimism is just seeing the way farmers are adopting. And that's, I see some of you in the room that have been doing this for so long. Some of you guys have been the leaders on this, and you've been the ones that have been developing these different ways of doing that. But I'm just starting to be able to see it on more acres being implemented at a larger level. So cover crops aren't something, they're not going to happen overnight, and they shouldn't. Going back, we look at our goals and what the industry, what the environment wants out of us. Cover crops are not something that should occur overnight. It's going to take a long time to develop the knowledge base, to develop the advisors, to develop the farmers to take on these systems. And so I do see us making progress. I think that's kind of my biggest look at this last year. So.
Great job. Opening up the floor for questions.
Dan, have you seen the tiles take longer to start running as your cover crops have been in there longer and longer? Like you're building up soil structure, and that as it rains, the soil can hold more of that water before it runs out the tile? Are you seeing any of that, like reduced flows from rains?
In the long-term field there at Eric Miller's, he's able to go in and no-till, and in a dry year, we find that we don't see the stress on the corn. Now, whether or not the time from rain, once we're saturated, we go through the tile pretty quick. But with that structure that he's built over the last 10 years, we see the crop able to survive through the drier weather a lot longer. We see a lot less stress on the crop because it is a sponge, because it's holding a lot more moisture within there. And I think that's probably what I've seen more than anything. Lowell?
We didn't see any difference in top flow with cover. No less, no more.
As the systems are longer, and you're building up that soil structure.
Thanks. Yes, but at this point, we hadn't seen it. No, we get so saturated in the spring that the same amount of tile flow happened across all of our treatments. So it was no. Now, winter wheat shuts the tile off a couple of months earlier than corn and soybean. That's an interesting fact, because it's bolting when corn and soybeans just being put in the ground.
Now, you might see that. That brings up a good point, Lowell. You might see that when you let your CRI go to head and you're starting to try to fill grain. We don't go that far. We try to grab. We're looking at nitrate loss, and in the process, we don't go to that headed out CRI and planting green.
How are we doing in terms of 2035 for the 45% in loss? How's that coming along?
We can do it, but we're gonna take implementation. It's going to take some change, and I think I fought change. It had to be slapped upside the head with the research that we've been doing for me to understand that this can work. And I was setting, I'm 70 years old. I was setting my ways, and when I started working with Lowell and John Pike and Eric Miller and saw what we were able to do, that's when I got enthused about this and said, well, we can do this across all the lands. We have the systems. We know what the system is to reach 45%. It's just going to take some changes, and we got to be willing to make those changes. A cover crop ahead of soybeans every other year and targeting your nitrogen applications, it's a timing thing, and also it's a rate thing. So let's get down to the MRTN rate. The MRTN rate, I worked with Dr. Knopfsinger for many years. We were around the state and we put in these N-rate trials. We know that nitrogen rate is correct, and that's where you need to be. You need to be somewhere below 200 pounds. Well, in the survey that IFCA is doing, I'm finding that we are at about 180, 190 pounds of N with the applied nitrogen. But what Clough said was the incidental nitrogen, which is the MAP, DAP, MES10, all those other products, they're not being counted. So once we count them in this survey, because we're counting every pound of nitrogen, we're at 220, 210, 215. So we found out at Tuscola that if we zero in on that about 180, that crop is not nitrogen starved, but it's not leaving a lot out there for the cereal rye to pick up. I guarantee you, and I've seen N-rate trials where we've followed up with cereal rye after an N-rate trial, so that's a 0, 50, 100, 150, 200, 250. I can find the randomized outline of the 250, the 200, and sometimes the 150. You see that. Eric Miller does a stalk nitrate test. He's got 2 N-rate trials for us. He's got one in the 3-crop rotation, which is all no-till and strip-till and wheat, and he's got one in the field that's tilled. We got a tillage trial. They're totally different, but he's doing an N-rate. He's doing stalk nitrate, and once you get to that above 200 pounds, the stalk nitrate is higher, and it's every year. And we got documentation, 8 years, Lowell, something like that.
You talk about that 1.5 ton, I'm over here. You talk about the 1.5 ton of biomass. How tall is that and how thick is that planted?
So we're running about 60 pounds of seed per acre and probably around knee high, something like that. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think, and that's probably one of the biggest keys is to visualize that, because that makes it achievable, 1.5 tons. You're a cattle guy, you probably have an idea of what that looks like, but you get away from a livestock guy, they have no idea what 1.5 tons looks like. So yeah, I think quantifying that has been a huge deal to start making it achievable, so.
All right, Jim, I'm going to have you take the clicker and click to the next slide. I set up a little fun surprise slide deck to kind of give a visual and let Dan and Jim kind of just do rapid fire of, what are their comments. So this is actually of Jay's field, and you've all heard him talk about using the strip till in cover crops. What are your recommendations when using strip till in cover crops? Does it have to be up? Can it be at the same time? Also, are you seeing different kind of applications that can bring this more precision to cover crop plantings?
How many tons do you think that is? Do you have an idea how many? That would be about your half ton, probably? Maybe a little bit more than that. Maybe a little more than a half ton. So again, just to quantify the tonnage, you really don't have to get that big to get that half ton, 3/4 of a ton. So strip tillage, I think absolutely with cover crops has been huge. I think it's something that you guys have done largely since the beginning, and I think one of the reasons why you haven't had some of the issues others have had in terms of yield losses, especially with corn. I think this is really, really important when we talk about planting corn into a cereal cover crop like this. Strip tillage is going to be huge. We're seeing a big interest again in strip tilling ahead of soybeans, obviously because of earlier planting, which when we talk about earlier planting of soybeans, it has really put quite a monkey wrench into the expectation of a cover crop. If we go back 10 to 15 years ago, when cover crops were first coming out, we were planting our soybeans in the middle of May. We almost always saw a nice positive when we were planting soybeans into our cover crop fields, because when we were doing it, it was warm, it was dry. That cover crop was pretty well kind of all upside when it came to that. Now the guys are wanting to plant a lot sooner in the year. They're out there in early April, mid-April. We start to kind of have to manage that cover crop a little bit differently. So even guys who were saying, 10 years ago I tried strip tilling soybeans and I didn't really see a positive out of it. Now that they're planting earlier, they're starting to play around with that again and wanting to go back out there and try that strip tilling. And even also the planting green aspect, as we move earlier and earlier with our planting, I like to terminate around that boot stage or a little bit earlier, cereal rye. So that used to be something that you could do. You could go out, you could terminate, you can maybe wait 10 days to 2 weeks to come out and do your actual planting, which I think from an agronomic perspective is actually still pretty good, except for the planting date. We're in a scenario now where people want to plant earlier, so that makes that planting green in order to time that with the termination much more important. And then the strip tillage, especially as we talk about nutrient management, becomes very important, especially on the corn side of things. So there's a lot to that. I think we see a lot more, partially because cover crops are so tied with no-till that sometimes we don't kind of allow the conversation to go to strip till, but it is definitely something that's been a key part of it.
One of the things that comes to mind when looking at that, so Eric will plant cover crops with a 15-inch row planter, and then when he comes back in and plants his soybeans, he goes between those rows of cover crop. That helps. with the strip till, one of the things that I wish I'd brought that, had that picture up from this past spring. We were doing some strip tills, soybeans 30-inch rows, and we added fertility in the fall. So we had some MESZ or MAP or DAP or something in the row. And then we had the 15-inch rows and some of the 30-inch rows that were not fertilized. Well, the cereal rye, by the time we got around to planting it, was probably 8 inches taller where we had the fertilizer, even in the band. The cereal rye had gone into that furrow and picked up that nitrogen, so we didn't lose any nitrogen. And then, like Lowell would say, if you terminate early enough, you'll bring that nitrogen's in that plant back out of that plant earlier, then rather than letting it go to a stalk or whatever, the leaf will break down quicker. One of the things I like, and John Pike's been working on this for several years, is precision planting of cover crops, where he leaves a strip open in there when he's planting it. So you're using RTK, you plant your cereal rye, but you leave that strip open. If you're in a no-till system, it's almost as good as if you've been in a no-till system for a while, you don't really need to go to strip till. You can transition to no-till, and that way you've got your cover crop is leaving a gap for you to plant into. It's bare ground, and you've gotten the weed control out of it too, same time. But that's something that followed John. He talks about that quite a bit.
Seeing the cereal rye there makes me think also about termination. I've heard more about, maybe not with cereal rye, but more maybe an annual rye or something like that, trying to terminate without the residuals. Well, any thoughts along that, whether you can put your residual products in with the termination?
So last year was one year where, for some reason, a lot of people saw that the residual in with the burn down allowed some of the cereal rye to survive, and we had an issue last year. It wasn't severe, but the cereal rye didn't die. So I have never applied a residual with my burn down. I always want to do a burn down separately, and that's, I don't know if that comes from the old chemical guy or not, but that was always something. I didn't want to antagonize that Roundup from killing the plant and killing it completely.
Yeah, so obviously, first of all, when you're talking about annual ryegrass, it's extremely important. That one's kind of in a world on its own. But when we look at these, cereal rye, barley, with the growers, that I work with through these different programs, there's usually not significant issues, but every once in a while something comes up, similar to what you said. It's not like it didn't kill it at all, but for some reason maybe it didn't get a complete kill, and we can usually trace it back to using some of the known troublemakers with your mixed in with your glyphosate. So it isn't all residuals. There are specific ones we watch out for, and they're notably the triazines. So your atrazine on the corn side, on the soybean side, the one that probably causes the most problem is metribuzin, which is your Sancor products, which are in a lot of tank mixes. Very few people are actually applying Sancor, but it gets into a lot of these tank mixes, and when we go back and, if somebody had a problem, they almost always are using those. So is it enough to warrant taking it out of your mix? Maybe not necessarily, at least early on. Just be aware that it could cause a problem, and I think most guys who go down the road of using cover crops every year are going to find a way to put that in a different pass. They're just going out there with just the glyphosate, so that they're not having any issues with the termination. Callisto is another one that sometimes causes problems. Isn't in burn downs too often, but sometimes somebody's using it. So it is a concern, and if you're doing annual ryegrass, you absolutely need to follow all the rules. Purdue actually has a really good guide if you go under their extension service about how to tank mix, how to do everything right. Anybody who's got annual ryegrass should follow that to the T. If you're doing these cereals, the problem is less common, but it is something that comes up. But it's only a certain percentage of the time. That's the struggle. You're not always going to have a problem. So lots of guys do it. Oh, I do this every year. I never have a problem. And then, 1 out of 10 years or whatever it is, the problem comes up. Yeah.
Repeat the question.
Yeah, so the question is in regards to the pH and the conditioning of the water. Again, I'm not necessarily a chemical guy. That is obviously one of the steps a lot of people take. getting that correct. I'm not sure how. I know some guys do go a little more extreme on how low they want to get that. So again, following the right label rates and following this Purdue Extension guide. That's why I hand it out to people, because it lists all that information, like what you should have in terms of tank mixing and properly conditioning the water. But pH, yeah, the right water is extremely important. You got to pay attention to what your water is when you're putting it in.
Do you want to click the next slide?
I don't know. Do I want to click the next slide?
I did not prep them, and so this was actually a great. That was an annual ryegrass field, Jim. Do you just want to touch base just quickly on what happened?
Don't use gramoxone to terminate annual ryegrass. Yeah, I know gramoxone has become a little more popular, especially to the south, because of weed-resistant issues, but it is definitely, you will get some kill, and if you don't get a good termination, the first shot with annual ryegrass using gramoxone could be important, but we need to make sure that these contact killers on something like an annual ryegrass aren't going to work very well. You just have a very large root structure underneath something like annual ryegrass, and using something like a contact killer isn't going to work very good. If you're against glyphosate, you're probably not going to want to have annual ryegrass in your system, just because you're really going to need something like that. You can use clethodim, something like that, if you need to, if you're really against using glyphosate, but oftentimes you're going to see more than one application needed to get a really good kill. So the other moral of the story is not to use annual ryegrass if you're in a non-GMO system. And in fact, even any of the cereals, if you're using non-GMO corn, you got to be really careful that you're getting a good kill early on and not having to come in with a rescue treatment.
We found for terminating annual rye, a winter vortex is probably one of the best systems. That was in one we tried. So we on the corn side, we tried trying to get oats and radish established for a couple of years, never did get it. So we said, oh, we'll go to annual rye. Went to annual rye, and we had a winter vortex, wiped it out. And so then we ended up started going with winter wheat. But anyway, yeah, we haven't messed with annual rye all that much on any of our trials, except the one time that it did fail.
Okay, I want to do one more slide. We have like a minute left. So this is 2019. Obviously, that was the year of wet planting. Do you guys want to touch base on maybe the top mistakes you saw from 2019 and what we learned from it?
So we were at Tuscola, and that's a Milford soil. It used to be an old seabed, right, Lowell? Lake bed. And that was most of the year that year. I think we planted the corn and beans about June 1st that year. It was horrible down there. We had enough flooding where in the fall that we lost some of our cereal rye stand where the cereal rye made it. It planted fine, so we didn't have any problems. I guess I'm not sure what the question really was about it, but I don't want to repeat 2019 again.
Yeah, so where you couldn't get in early, I think that was kind of the biggest concerns about 2019. And granted, a lot of farmers did hear the message about planting green and about not wanting to terminate your rye and then end up with saturated conditions. So I mean, hats off to the farmers at that time. They understood that message. They were very wary about going out and terminating early because they didn't want to continue getting the rains and then face that issue where they were going to have those wet, saturated soils. But unfortunately, 2019, it just kept raining. So you ended up with a lot of very tall rye, a lot of situations that had they terminated earlier, by the time we were able to get into the field, the rye would have been deteriorated. But I think the two things that stick out in my mind from 2019, looking at a picture like this, is the idea of just because you can doesn't mean that you should. We hear a lot of situations where people give a testament to their soil health and cover crops about being able to get out on a field early, which is absolutely true and oftentimes is very warranted. But we do see situations where just because it'll float your tractor across the field because you've got that soil health or that rye, you really have to think about the damage that you're doing to that soil long term, because once you do something like that, it's extremely difficult to get that kind of compaction out of a soil without some sort of tillage. And then the last thing I would say is in terms of the canopy that rye caused, working with growers in the 2019 year, we had some guys that went out with just rollers, not roller crimpers, but they still did a chemical termination, and they went out with a roller and just knocked that rye down. And we saw significant improvements in yield in that situation compared to just
Try the next slide.
compared to just planting.
Keep going. Keep going. There you go.
Compared to just planting into that canopy with the rye. So this one is just actual wheel tracks, but you can see the difference on the right-hand side in the nodes, how elongated they were, just looking at where the wheel track was, where it knocked down the rye versus where it let that rye stand. But we had guys doing whole fields this way, taking out those land rollers, those 60-foot wide land rollers, and just knocking that rye down when it was that tall. Otherwise, that rye is still standing in August and in September and can even be there at harvest. So if you ever get to that point where we see that rye still standing or really doing that heavy canopy, doing something to get it knocked over, that's what's going to happen once we get to that higher carbon to nitrogen ratio, a little bit higher in the year. So I think that was one of the other big learning points from 2019 is how impactful knocking that rye canopy down could be.
I do remember now in 2019, that was the year we bought a Gator with a auto steer and a 200-gallon sprayer with a 60-foot boom. So with our research stuff, we do have the ability to get through some of those muddy conditions. This brings up a good point. So we, down at Douglas County, we did a crimping and no crimping trial where we harvested, and we didn't find any difference in the yield between the two. What we did find out was if we didn't have that cereal rye on the ground, when we harvested and it got a little bit damp towards the evening, they drug up on our soybean, our bean head. So that was one of the things, trying to get that residue probably helps having it laying flat on the ground when it comes to harvestability.
Thank you both. And for me, this is cut way too short. We're at the end of our time. Obviously, Jim and Dan have a wealth of knowledge. You have their contact information. The agronomy team at ISA are extremely excited to be working with both Jim and Dan on projects moving forward and what we do together. I hope you see value from just even this small snippet of information. I do want to touch bases. Dan did mention the nutrient loss reduction strategy, and the efforts towards those reductions need to be taken very seriously. And in your own operations, I'm glad Dan covered that. Jim, as well as taking what we have seen as far as in other people's fields, but being able to apply it to multiple scenarios and see across the board that we can see impacts to these agronomic tools is something that's greatly needed as far as guidelines in the state and what we can actually use as recommendations. So I know a lot of people in the room might be at different stages of adoption of cover crops and you know where you're at in the transition, or if it's something you want to approach or something that you're ready for the next step of something new and advanced. So really what I'm going to do, my wrap-up question for Dan and Jim is, going into this next growing season, what are you excited to see for cover crops, and what's something or that you'd want to study? Well, Dan, you've got your great studies going on, but what is something that you want to see this next year with cover crops and see what they can do?
I guess on our own farm and then other farms, just really looking at the strip tilling with soybeans. I think that's what, you know, we've stayed away from that with planting solid stands of cereal rye, but this year we might be looking into planting 30-inch row beans, at least on some fields, and applying a strip with a spring strip freshener just to kind of go after the earlier planting soybeans. So I definitely see that as kind of necessary in order to get after that earlier planting.
For those that have planted a cover crop this past year, we've had a rather warm November, December, and now going into February it's warm. We're going to get a lot of growth out of the cover crop. I'm kind of excited to see what the tile nitrates look like. I think we're going to have a pretty good reduction, and with the growth of the cover crop, we're going to see the benefits from that nitrogen reduction. The year before, not so much, but I think this year in the tillage trial we have at Eric Miller's, we're going to see that because we got good growth from the covers.
Thank you so much. Let's give them a round of applause. And so you're going to be off to your next breakout session, and my script is all the way at the front, but just for all you CCAs, CEUs are available at the front near the registration desk, and your next session begins at 2. Any session with me goes long, so you got 9 minutes. Thank you. it. My voice is loud. All right. Okay, we're hitting a little past 2, so if we want to get settled in for the next breakout, welcome to the second session of the panel breakout room. My name is Abigail Peterson. I am a certified crop advisor and director of the agronomy department at IFCA. All right, here we jump to it. I'm pleased to introduce this session's speakers, Kelly Estes and Dr. Nick Seiter. Kelly is an entomologist with the Illinois Natural History Survey at the University of Illinois. As the State Ag Pest Survey Coordinator, she coordinates trapping and surveys not only for economic and emerging field crop pest, but invasive species as well. She received her BS and master's degree in crop sciences from the University of Illinois. Dr. Seiter is a field crop entomologist with the University of Illinois. He develops insect management recommendations for soybean and corn production in Illinois, has a PhD in entomology from Clemson University, his BS and master's degree in entomology from Purdue. Today, our presenters will recap soybean insect pest issues of 2023, including recent results of surveys for Desicc stem borer and potentially invasive soybean gall midge, as well as information on management of these insect pests. In addition, management recommendations and chemical control results for green cloverworm and bean leaf beetle will be discussed. Before we get started, as a reminder, please use the microphones during the Q&A so others in the room and online can hear you. Let's welcome Nick and Kelly.
Thanks for having us. I was just telling Nick, we really gave a lot of information back in October. I drew the short straw and I get to go first. And honestly, Nick and I are pretty easygoing, and we can either talk with slides or we can have a true panel discussion. I do have lots of slides, not that I necessarily want to use them all. This is the problem. They gave us a deadline, and then last night I'm like, I don't like any of the slides I gave you. So my part in this is recapping our state pest ag survey, and we do this every year in mid-July. This is one of the longest standing pest surveys, definitely in the Midwest, potentially in the United States as well. This goes all the way back easily into the 70s. This is a survey we conduct every year in corn and soybeans. We do this in mid-July. We try to represent 4 to 5 counties out of every crop reporting district. And basically what that means is my interns drive randomly around the state. As we hit selected counties, they find a soybean field with a cornfield next to it. We do 100 sweeps on the exterior, 100 sweeps on the interior. Then they go across to the cornfield. They move past the end rows, and then they do a visual survey for western corn rootworm. And so a lot of what our goal is with this survey is to get an idea of pest pressures and pest populations that we're seeing in different areas of the state. This is a huge survey, and so this is why I don't like my slides. It's a lot of information to present to you, either as one big slide that's really messy and busy, or I can break it down, and then I have 12 different slides. So I highlighted some of our more predominant soybean pests that we look for. And what I did was I gave you a couple years worth of information. So you can see just recently what some of the pest trends are. This is a kind of a difficult survey to, in some ways, pull information from. Obviously, some of it is very straightforward. These are the pests that we're finding. But there's a lot of stuff that's hard to take into account. Because it is a random survey, we don't know any of the management practices that are going on, timing of when we do the survey versus when some of you are starting to spray fungicides and insecticides, and that is a huge impact on what we're finding. For instance, Japanese beetles is what we're starting with. And this past summer, we're out doing some of our other field crop pests, and it's the beginning of July. And my interns come back from Macoupin County with counts of 300 beetles in 100 sweeps. Huge numbers. And they're sending pictures from the field. This is crazy because they hadn't seen this yet. I'm like, that's great. This is beginning of July. We're going to hit the 4th of July holiday. Be prepared when we get back. This is 2 weeks of intense survey. By the time we get back and start this survey, planes are flying. Everything's going. And so we're racing the clock trying to get to different areas of the state before you do. So we look at some of our numbers of Japanese beetles, and these numbers are actually pretty low. If you would go back into like 2018, 2019, those were numbers of over 300, 500 beetles in western Illinois. So overall, pest densities of Japanese beetles were pretty low this year compared to many recent years. But what's interesting is that we get variability not only within the crop reporting district, but within each county. Oops. So if we look primarily here in the east central part of the state, and I'm just highlighting a couple counties that had maybe higher counts than what we saw in some of the other areas. And so we look at Ford County, you pull that out, and they were averaging 52 beetles per 100 sweeps. And so what that probably means is we had several locations in that county that had higher, but then we probably had a couple fields of 0, which drew that average down. You'll notice a trend as we go through some of these different pests that Coles, Cumberland, and Clark is where we saw higher pest densities of several different insect species. You can stop me at any time if you have questions. I'm completely okay with that. Otherwise, I just get going. We look at western corn rootworm. It's a pest that a lot of different people are interested in, not only in soybeans, but our counts in corn. The past 10, 11 years, numbers have been pretty low. But what we are finding is that even though averages are really, really low, what we're finding is hot spots of higher western corn rootworms. And you will have a soybean field that's loaded down with westerns. You go 5 miles down the road and there's nothing. So management practices are playing a huge part in that, as well as potential spots of potential resistance. And within our east central region, Livingston, Ford, Iroquois, and Coles all had averages of, I believe, 1 to 2 to 3 beetles per 100 sweeps, which is actually pretty low, but higher than what we saw throughout the rest of the state. Not so much of interest necessarily here in east central Illinois, but in the northwest and the west, even down in through some parts of central like McLean County, we pick up northerns, and actually quite a few northerns. Areas with continuous corn generally have a lot more northern corn rootworm. Interestingly enough, this year, when we were doing the survey, counts were very low. And then as we were back in fields in August for some of our other work, northern corn rootworm populations were very high. And we were getting calls about it, questions about it, and it actually just gets a lot of hallway chatter with Joe Spencer and I trying to figure out what's going on. And so more than likely some delayed emergence, potentially like maybe the drought, just delayed some of that emergence with northerns this year. Bean leaf beetles, which I believe you're gonna talk about some of bean leaf beetle stuff. Something that we continue in the survey, although in general it's very, we get very low numbers of bean leaf beetles. We tend to see higher bean leaf beetle numbers earlier in the spring, and then later again in the fall in September, but midsummer we just really don't see a lot of those. And once again, and this is where that recurrence, Livingston, Coles, Cumberland, and Clark had higher than average numbers in this particular area. Stink bugs are something we get questions on every so often, usually in some no-till situations, and usually earlier in the spring. It's something that draws a lot of interest, particularly as for pod feeders. 2, we're also trying to keep an eye on brown marmorated stink bug levels. As someone who does invasive species work, that's a newer invasive that is more of a nuisance pest in your house. So this winter, as you're seeing potentially stink bugs flying around in your house, those aren't your normal brown stink bugs, but brown marmorated stink bugs that are more of a threat out east, causing higher economic injury in soybeans there. But it is something we are starting to pick up in soybean fields here. So the question is, are we seeing damage from brown marmorated stink bugs? Not only in field crops, but potentially in orchards. So brown marmorated stink bug has a very large host range and is a huge threat to specialty crops. We do see some injury levels in orchards, but they have such high management practices, so we're on scheduled sprays and things like that, that keeps that injury pretty low. So they overwinter as adults, and they're just kind of hanging out in barns and houses, underneath tree bark, things like that. And so early in the spring, as things start to warm up, as daylight increases, they begin their activity and move out. And so with orchards particularly, or even vineyards, the places most at risk are along tree lines, because they'll move from their overwintering to tree lines and then to their preferred host crop. So I think there's probably some targeted spraying along those areas as well. Dectus stem borer is something that we are been interested in the past couple of years. It hasn't always been involved or included in the survey, but something that has actually been around Illinois for quite some time. We've seen it throughout the state, and why we consider it more of an issue in southern Illinois. We do get reports of it as far north as DeKalb County. We've picked up in Pike and Adams counties, but the highest populations are generally in the southern part of the state, and that's predominantly based on management of soybeans in that part of the state. So they tend to do better in no-till situations where there's more residue. And we're actually picking up quite a few adults in those areas. Over the past 4 years, Wayne, Hamilton, and Saline have been very big hotspots for Dectus stem borer. This year we also picked up in Perry. Last year, Washington and Clinton counties also had quite a few Dectus stem borer in them as well. And so it's just something we're interested in and continue to monitor populations here year after year. Next, going to cover some cloverworm and looper information here. This is something that's also in the survey, and I group them together. We do actually separate counts, but of which one. We tend to get more cloverworm in this particular survey, and this is also a timing thing. Our survey indicated very few cloverworm in mid-July, but if you think back to last fall, come August and September, everybody wants to know what the black moths are flying around lights, along roadways, hitting your windshield. So we had a huge increase in population late in the season with green cloverworm last year. And once again, Coles, Cumberland, Clark, and even Jasper had higher numbers. And I think probably this has mostly to do with we started our survey in the southeast area. We generally base that on who started planting first. Well, with pest development, if it's warmer in the south first, we'll start there and then work our way to later planted stuff. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nick.
All right. Oh, there's a clicker too. I got to put my pop down. Thank you. Yes. Any questions before we kind of continue on talking about? Yeah.
You had the counts up there about the northern corn rootworm. I know in the continuous corn areas in northwestern Illinois, they're doing a lot of fully straight corn with running chlorinated insecticide. Do you guys see a lot of issues with resistance starting in doing that practice?
Yeah. yeah. There's a lot of resistance. So I gave a talk this morning down in Collinsville. We spent most of the time talking about corn rootworm and resistance, and that's what I talk about more than probably anything else. And with both species, we've got resistance to all 4 Bt proteins that are available in some areas. So most areas don't have resistance to all 4 of those in the same population. Some areas do. If you're up into DeKalb County, you'll probably have a hard time killing corn rootworm just with Bt traits. But it varies a lot depending on where you're at in the state. The corn on corn, like you mentioned, that's going to be the big driving factor. So like the more corn on corn we have in an area, the more of a resistance problem we have, and the higher the numbers are. Like the higher the numbers are coming out in the survey and in just reports from farmers. And you know, you can take that the other way too. Like the best thing you can do to break up your population is to rotate. One thing we don't see a lot of, exactly like Kelly mentioned, is like the rotation-resistant variant anymore, especially here in East Central Illinois. Our numbers in soybean, for the most part, low. And it's kind of, in a lot of ways, gone back to what it used to be, where we really deal with this insect in a big way in these corn after corn areas. In areas like East Central Illinois, where we're almost exclusively rotated corn and soybean, we don't have much of a problem. Yeah. Any other questions? Talk a little bit about little bright moths, little brown moths. My colleague down in Tennessee used to call them DBMs. It was damn brown moth. If you asked him to identify one of those, that's what he'd call it. I don't know. It's brown moth. There's a lot of brown moths. What we were seeing last year almost exclusively was green clover worm. And what was really kind of interesting, you know, this is like a lot of moths where it can come in on wind patterns and that kind of thing. We saw them everywhere, like all the way from southern Illinois all the way up to northern Illinois. We had high populations of these moths. What we saw in soybeans from this, like in soybeans from these green clover worm, was a lot more variable. This is an insect that I think most of us that deal with insect pests in soybean think of as kind of a wimp, like kind of a wimpy little pest, you know? They're very susceptible to diseases, to a variety of parasitoids. And so you see these wild kind of boom and bust cycles with them. And I know, like, I think it was 2 years ago. I get my years confused now, so I think it was 2 years ago. I saw like 5 green cloverworm larvae the entire year. Like it was fewer than I've ever seen. Worked in soybean, Indiana, South Carolina, Arkansas here. All of those states, there's green cloverworm in almost every field, but that wasn't the case necessarily in 2022, if I'm getting my years right. If I'm not, I apologize. Last year we had quite a few of them. And again, later on in the season, this time, again, with these moth pests that kind of can fly in from elsewhere, there's some variability on when they're really affecting us, depending on when those flights come through. Few things to note about green cloverworm. I think most of you are probably aware of this, but just to reiterate, the moths are not a problem necessarily, per se. Like, they don't do any injury. They're sort of aggravating sometimes, but they, in and of themselves, they don't do anything. It's the larvae that are feeding on soybean foliage. And we did get some reports, and I talked about this down south, and I was almost kind of sorry I brought it up, because I asked people if they had heard about green cloverworm feeding on pods, and they all looked at each other like, nah, we haven't heard of that. It's like, well, good, they don't feed on pods. Like, they don't feed on pods, they feed on foliage. But we got a few of those reports last year, and I suspect what was going on was either corn earworm, which does feed on soybean seeds. We don't see it as a pest in soybean terribly often through most of Illinois. Down in Arkansas, where I used to be, this was the big pest. Like, this was the one that we worried about the most in soybean. They'll feed on the seeds. Grasshoppers will do that as well. And with grasshoppers, it's almost always going to be on the edge of the field. You know, they don't really want to be out in a soybean field unless there's a lot of grass weeds or they got nothing else to feed on, right? So we don't really worry about pod feeding by grasshoppers very much, but they can do it, and it looks a lot like that. And it's right on the edge of the field where you're likely to see it. Corn earworm will do that. And we don't usually struggle with corn earworm and soybean in Illinois. We don't usually see very many of them. But it can happen. My instinct is that someone saw a little bit of this pod feeding from one of those two insects and attributed it to the fairly large numbers of green cloverworm that we saw later on. So they were sort of coming in after the fact and taking the blame for that. That happens a lot with some of our insect pests, right? We don't always attribute that injury to the correct insect, and there's always insects out in soybean fields. So that would be my guess on that. If you never heard of green cloverworm feeding on pods before, pretend I didn't say anything, because they don't. But if anybody tells you they got green cloverworm feeding on pods, you can tell them, no, I don't think that happened. I don't think that was what was going on. But we do have some pod feeders. Okay, this last year we got green cloverworm numbers high enough on our farms up here that we put out a little chemical trial. That was eventful for us. It doesn't happen very often. We sort of struggle to get good data on this insect because they tend to collapse, right? This particular trial was so exciting, I came off paternity leave to spray it. My wife was psyched. She was really, really happy that I did that. So I took a risk for these data, so just wanted you all to know that before we put them up. I was the only one on the crew who had a license, so it had to be me. One thing that was kind of interesting this last year, so usually with green cloverworm, we think of this as an insect that is not very hard to kill, right? And these data would bear that out for the most part. We did get a little bit of an odd thing here with Warrior. We sort of struggled with Warrior to get good control of green cloverworm in this particular trial. That is not something we expect. You'll note there's a lot of variability there, right? Like that's what the size of that bar indicates, a lot of variability. And I wouldn't point it out at all. I would have assumed that like I forgot to add that stuff into the tank, or I mixed up the raw rate or did something stupid. Not that I've ever done anything like that, not in my trials, certainly. But we had bean leaf beetle in the same trial, and as you'll see in a few minutes here, it did exactly what it's supposed to do on bean leaf beetle. This one report from the field doesn't mean a whole lot, right? We see a lot of variability with our efficacy, but something to keep an eye out on. And the reason, of course, Lambda is significant, Warrior that's probably the most widely used foliar insecticide in Illinois. Again, I don't necessarily expect that's some sort of a long-standing problem, but an interesting observation we had in this particular trial. Everything else looked at what it was supposed to. It killed them. We don't have to kill green cloverworm too terribly often. Like they don't justify an insecticide application very often. And we'll talk a little bit about the defoliation thresholds later, but soybean in general, and y'all know this, tolerates defoliation really well. And that insect doesn't feed on pods. Bean leaf beetle, a little bit different because in some cases it will feed on the pods themselves. And we've seen a fair bit of that in this part of the state over the last several years. Identification, I think most of you can probably identify this insect fairly well, but that's a fairly good picture of what you're looking for, which is that little black triangle behind. That little, we call that little structure there behind their head the pronotum. Like right behind that, there's a black triangle that points to the back. It's your entomology trivia for the day, is the pronotum. With bean leaf beetle, again, they defoliate. The larvae feed on the roots and the nodules below ground. We don't really think about that very much. It doesn't really cause any harm. The adults are feeding on the foliage. What's interesting about the adults, they're the first insect we see in soybean every year, and they're the last insect in a lot of ways that we see in soybean every year. It's actually that same generation, the overwintering generation, builds up in the fall, and then it'll come out of those overwintering sites in the spring. In the spring, that damage you see over there, pretty cosmetic for the most part. We don't worry a whole lot about that early season feeding. Vegetative soybean plants tolerate a lot of injury. If you're in a situation where you got bean pod mottle virus, this is a vector for that. That can change that a little bit, but by and large, we don't think about that early season feeding very much. But what they'll do towards the end of the season is they'll build up on soybean before they overwinter. They feed on the leaves. That can be bad sometimes. Not very often. Again, we don't exceed our economic thresholds from defoliation too terribly often. They'll also scar up the pods. Now, one thing you'll notice there compared to that picture I showed earlier, they're feeding on the pod itself, and they're feeding on that green tissue. They're sort of running out of leaf tissue, and they're scraping away at that pod. They're not injuring the seed directly when they do that. What happens is that pod will dry down, and as it dries down, you'll get cracks at those feeding sites. And that's what then allows water in and pathogens in. And you get generally more of an impact on quality than on yield, though you can lose some yield from that as well. And in terms of the impact of this species in Illinois, that is probably the larger impact rather than the feeding on foliage itself. Bean leaf beetles for us are pretty easy to kill. We don't struggle to kill them if they're in the field when that application goes out. What's not going to work to control them is the practice that we very often do, which is sticking a pyrethroid in the tank at R3 because we were going across with a fungicide and hoping that that's going to kill bean leaf beetle a month later. It's not going to do that. It's not going to be there. It's going to be there for about 5 to 7 days most of the time. Was there a question back there? Yeah, what's up? Yeah, the question was related to the timing of insecticide applications. Adam pointed out that when you spray at R3, very often it's associated with a fungicide. If you were going to time an application for an insecticide, what would be the best timing for that? And in my mind, when you look across Illinois, our economic infestations of insects are fairly uncommon. But when we have them, they tend to be more at the later pod stages, like R5 and R6. When we have damaging populations of insects, that's when it tends to be. Now, does every field have a damaging insect population at R5, R6? No, not even close. It's a small minority of fields that have that. And it raises, again, a good point about insect control, which is, a lot of times when we talk about weed management, I mean, every field needs herbicide, right? Obviously, you can't not manage weeds in a field. When you manage diseases, we got our new plant pathologist back there, by the way. I'm looking at him right now, pointing at him, just, that's Boris. He'd be able to tell you better, but with diseases, I feel like a lot of times they're trying to get more of a preventative, get it at kind of the beginning of that disease incidence, and perhaps they get a little more residual activity than we get with our insecticides. With insects, we don't get a lot of residual activity with most of those. So when you try these preventative applications, you got to think about, okay, I'm preventing something, but when am I preventing it? And if you're using, especially like a generic pyrethroid, which is what we're using most of the time if it's just in the tank because it's going across the field type of application, you'd better be preventing something in the next 5 to 7 days, 10 maybe. Generally, that's why we recommend more of an IPM-based approach, more of scouting and treating according to need. That's part of the reason. Part of the reason is just we don't see damaging, like economically damaging incidents of insects all that often, especially in soybean. One thing, the next slide we got here, first I'm reminding you that this field not only had bean leaf beetles at a pretty healthy number, by the way, that's 40 per 25 sweeps. So if we were comparing it back to like Kelly's survey, that was per 100 sweeps, that would have been what? Close to 200, something like that. It's a lot. Like, it's a lot of beetles when every time you're sweeping that net, you're getting almost 2 beetles, right? In addition, we had pretty close to 1 green clover worm per sweep in our untreated plots. It's a pretty high insect population. Here's the yield data. It's the untreated over here. And by the way, there's not a effect there, okay? This isn't a statistical difference. These were the same. Part of the reason we do these statistics, right, there's a lot of variability, plot-to-plot variability in yield. In this case, not only was the effect of insects on yield not larger than the variability that's out there, there wasn't one. And that's with a very high population of these defoliating insects. This is the reason why we can't stress enough, these plants can take a lot of defoliation before we get that injury. So again, how much is a lot? Before R3, 30% defoliation. Anyone in here ever seen 30% defoliation? It's going to catch your eye, okay? If you've got economically damaging defoliation before bloom, you're going to know it if you're anywhere close to that field at all. We've lowered these recently based on updated soybean prices and yield potentials. So we go with a 10% from R3 to R5. That's when it's the most sensitive. One thing to keep in mind, R3 to R5 is not when we see these defoliating insects most of the time, right? So that's when the plant is most sensitive to that injury. It's not necessarily when we're seeing a lot of that injury occurring. We increase it a little bit at R6, up to 15%, which is a lot. That's a picture of 15% over on the right. It's a lot. It looks pretty bad. And then at R7, you can walk away from it. You know, when those leaves start to yellow and fall off, well, probably controlling a defoliating insect at that stage doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? Down in Arkansas, every once in a while, they use a defoliant down there for soybeans a lot of times. Every once in a while, you get a question of if I should mix an insecticide in with the defoliant. No, you shouldn't mix it in with the defoliant. We didn't get those questions often, by the way. But, you know, every once in a while, you get some interesting ones. We're pretty confident that at that point, we don't have much to gain from protecting that. One thing to keep in mind with that pod feeding, okay, and you've got to be sure you know your bean leaf beetle feeding from like corn earworm feeding. Corn earworm, which we don't get very often, they're feeding directly on the seed. That's a problem, right? That's direct yield loss. Your threshold for corn earworm would be a lot lower than what it is for bean leaf beetle scarring the pods, which some of the time allows that moisture to get into the pod. That's why it's high. It's around 10% of pods scarred. You go a little more aggressive than that if it's happening earlier. But that's not saying 10% of seeds are getting injured, right? That would be a problem. That's saying 10% of the pods are getting scarred. Some lower percentage of those seeds are suffering quality issues because of that. And again, not something we see consistently, not something we see across farms. Just showed you the data from when we have a very high population of bean leaf beetles in our fields. We did not see a yield impact from that. So just something to keep in mind. And with that, I think I left plenty of time. Sometimes I do that. Sometimes I get the timing right. I think we'd be happy to take any questions that you might have. Yes? Yeah, good point. And the question was if any of our data are with 2 modes of action at R3. Not in this trial. We've done some of that before. It does last longer It's not going to carry you from R3 to the end of the season, but it does last longer when you have like one of those products with a neonic mixed in. So it'll be longer than 5 to 7 days, but it's not going to be 30 days. Yes?
Is there anything new on the integrated refuge for western corn rootworm beetle?
Yeah, the question is if there's anything new on integrated refuge for western corn rootworm. On the corn rootworm side, not at this time. It's still a 5% in the bag refuge for that insect if you've got a pyramided BT hybrid, which all of our BT hybrids are pyramided. The new RNAi products that are coming in, they're also coming in at a 5% integrated refuge. There's talk about changing some of that for above ground pests, particularly in the southern United States. There hasn't been a lot of talk about doing that in the Midwestern US at this point. The general feel that I get, and I'm not a like resistance modeler type person, I don't do that kind of work. The feel that I get from my colleagues who are is that the integrated refuge, although a lot of them will say 5% is probably not enough to effectively mitigate resistance, but they'll say with rootworm, an integrated refuge is probably better than a block refuge because of the way that insect behaves and because of the issues with compliance when we go with a block refuge. With the above ground insects, with the caterpillar pests, the block refuge is superior if compliance were not an issue. So if we always had that block refuge, then that block refuge would be superior for all of our above ground insects, or at least all the ones that I know of. Yeah, good question. Any other questions?
Is European corn borer included on any surveys?
The question is European corn borer included in any surveys? We used to do a stalk survey in the fall, and that ended in several years ago, many, many years ago, because of not being able to pick anything up because of all the new traits. We do a monitoring program, trapping. We do black cutworm and true armyworm in the spring, and then we transition to earworm, fall armyworm, and corn borer during the summer. We do have corn borer traps out. We rarely catch corn borer in a trap. So we try, but we have not had any luck lately. And so populations overall seem to be low, although we do get sporadic calls throughout the growing season of infestations of corn borer in non-traded, non-GMO focused areas.
Oh yeah, we can talk about gall midge. We can talk about gall midge. So gall midge is an invasive soybean pest. We think it's invasive. It's sort of new to science out in Nebraska and Iowa. It's something Kelly and I have both been surveying for, and I've been doing kind of a focused survey up along the border with Iowa, basically from the middle of the state all the way up to northwestern Illinois. You've been searching for it in all of your fields, right? This gall midge. We haven't found it. When we do find it, if we do find it, you'll hear about it. Like it's not going to be a secret if we find it in Illinois. But we haven't found it so far. My impression, talking to my colleagues out in Nebraska, is that it's not moving terribly fast. Like they keep finding it in new places, but it's mostly because they're looking for it. Like, as you might imagine, since no one knew this thing existed like 6-7 years ago, a lot of their efforts on it have really picked up. And so the closest it is like, it's kind of in central Iowa, but those areas in central Iowa where they found it, it's not like a pest there. They found it. Like they started looking for it and they found it. Where it's really impacting yield heavily is on the eastern border of Nebraska and the western border of Iowa. And it seems like it's fairly limited to that geography as a major yield impacting pest. Personally, I kind of hope it stays there because it's not fun to deal with. It's been a pretty serious problem for those farmers, but it's a relatively small acreage where they're really fighting it like as a major issue. Any other questions? Yeah.
Have they figured out how to treat it if it is a problem?
So most of the mechanisms they've found to treat it so far aren't methods that we're really going to necessarily like. Okay, so they're doing some work with hilling, like you would do with potatoes, you know, where you hill soil up on the base of the stem. It enters through the base of the stem. That actually seems to be pretty effective. And for those guys who are really struggling with this thing, it's worthwhile. They've tried chemicals. The only one I think they've gotten good efficacy from, I think it was Furidan. Yeah, I hear a few snickers at that. Some of you remember what Furidan is, right? It's been a while since we used that one. It's not an easy insect to kill, apparently. And part of the issue is, so like the adults, it's like Hessian fly. It's the same family as Hessian flies. So the adults are these little cryptic, tiny flies. They have a hard time even monitoring those adults. So you can't really get control of the adults because they don't know where they are or really how long they're flying or anything like that. Those larvae then are feeding on the inside of the plant. So you would think maybe like a systemic insecticide would control them, but apparently with the systemic insecticides we have available to us in soybean, they haven't gotten adequate control from that, from like the seed treatments, for instance. And those are the two methods I know of that have gotten effective control for them. So they're really, again, they're struggling with it, but there's also like a lot about even just the very basic biology that they don't know because it is brand new. Any other questions? If not, all right. Yeah, sure thing.
All right, let's give Kelly and Nick a round of applause. Great session. Looks like I got the CCA CEU credits up here, so if you are in person, please sign up here. If you are online, please find the CEU instructions in the chat. Our final breakout session will begin at 3 p.m. During breaks, I do encourage you to visit our partners in the trade show and the students that are participating in the student poster session, and we'll see you at 3. Thank you.
sorry.
No. Do you want, you and Robert can share?
Oh, that's fine. Yeah.
Test. You need to get your mic, buddy. It's been a long day.
Test.
I'm more comfortable up here now. People can't see me.
Their shirts were nice.
Oh, I like them.
I ran into the table with the girl sitting there asking if shirts are for sale. And I said, no. Nice design.
Try to do a theme.
What's that?
Try to do a theme.
That's a good one. So you designed it?
We hired a company to do it. Yeah, a marketing type contractor. They're here today, actually, too.
So they look good.
Yeah, thank you. They do a lot of all our stuff, like the slides and signage. Yeah.
Kind of retro looking
Yes.
font.
We like that.
Yeah, so do I. So who else did I meet?
I guess, am I supposed to just be the moderator? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So my name's Stephanie Porter, and I'm the outreach agronomist for the Illinois Soybean Association, and I'm just going to let these gentlemen here introduce themselves to you.
Good afternoon. I'm Steve Clough. I'm a research geneticist, pathologist with the USDA here on campus, University of Illinois.
I'm Carl Bradley. I'm a plant pathologist with the University of Kentucky, formerly with the University of Illinois. I left in 2015 to go to the University of Kentucky.
Robert Bellm. I'm a field agronomist for Brase Farms in Madison County, Illinois, and retired University of Illinois Extension.
So we're going to start off here, if we want to flip to a couple slides here. Let's start with my favorite subject, the disease triangle. Okay, so when we go and look at the disease triangle for red crown rot, Carl, can you give us a rundown on infection timing, what kind of environment's needed, and basically hosts of this pathogen of red crown rot?
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. And anybody else wants to join in, they're welcome to. So, well, first off, you can't have a disease without the disease triangle. So that means you have to have the pathogen present, you have to have the susceptible host present, and you have to have the right environment. And so, suddenly we've got red crown rot when it didn't used to occur. Back when I was with U of I, we didn't, as far as I know, we didn't have it. So that means one of those things had to change. Was it the host? Was it the pathogen? Was it the environment? Or some combination of those three? So that's one thing I guess we need to keep in mind is something changed. And so we have this new disease that we didn't deal with before. So red crown rot is caused by a fungus. It's called Calinectria illicicula. It lives in the soil. It can infect actually pretty early. When soybeans start to germinate and emerge, this fungus can start to infect those young seedling roots. It can cause, while soybeans are growing, you can see, if you're out there looking, you can actually see some reddish discoloration on the lower stem and roots, even in the vegetative stages. And later on, you can see foliar symptoms, and those are because this pathogen produces a toxin that's translocated up and goes into the leaves, and you can see foliar symptoms, which we'll look at in a little bit. As far as conditions that are favorable, from what's in the literature, I say that because there's a whole lot of work we probably need to do on our isolates that we have in this region. So historically, red crown rot was down in the deep south, in Louisiana and Mississippi, but we have it here now, and so we don't know if all the research that was done in the 1990s in Louisiana if that's going to match what's happening in Illinois and Kentucky and Indiana as well. But what we know from the literature is that soil temperature is important for infection, and it's actually a little bit warmer. I think it's 78 to 86 degrees, right around in that time frame, what's known. It seems like you need to have some soil moisture to get better infection as well, so environment can play a pretty key role as well.
Okay. So both Carl and Steve, I'll pass the mic to you, Steve, as well. Let's talk history of red crown rot in the U.S., and then let's focus in where is it in the Midwest now.
Okay, so I just put down some of the literature for when the pathogen was identified. So this could be a little bit boring, but basically in 1912, it was found in Ireland on holly. In 48, it was found, it was reported in Indonesia. In that paper, they don't say what it came off of. They said they were able to deduce the sexual stage on potato. That could have been, growing stuff on potato disc or like potato PDA or something like that. But anyway, it was found in Indonesia. In 66, it was found in the U.S. on peanut, causing black rot. In 69, it was reported on soybean in Japan. In 73, it was reported on soybean in the U.S., in North Carolina. 76, on soybean in Louisiana. In 93, some group in Holland changed the name. So basically, you see many different names on here. Eventually, they decided to just call it the Calanectria eleusicola, as Carlos mentioned. Okay, the next, in 94, so a lot of the research that was out there prior to today, some came from Louisiana, and a lot of it came from Japan, because Japan's had it, since I showed on the previous slide here, since '69. And their government put a lot of efforts into that during the 70s and 80s and 90s to try to control it. We were fortunate that this last summer, one of the main researchers on this disease from Japan was visiting Michigan State. And so he came down to Illinois, he met some of us, and helped educate us a bit on the disease. And he also translated a few of the articles that were written, because some of the earlier work was only printed in Japanese articles. So in '94, a Japanese group was showing that the movement was mainly mechanical, and they also showed that the microsporotia that are produced can survive in the soil for 7 years or more. In '99, they showed that grasses were not affected. They did a bit of a survey on alternative host. Sorghum was slightly infected, but otherwise other grasses were not infected. And they were proposing in Japan that they actually the scientists there told us they do a 2-year rotation with rice. It works fairly well at reducing disease incidence. 2004, in Louisiana, they were showing that the optimal growth was between 68 and 86 Fahrenheit for growing in a culture, and the ideal soil temperature was somewhere around 77 to 86. In Louisiana, they were showing that over 95, got no infection. So my understanding was that they were showing in their papers that if they delayed planting, because Louisiana was super hot, if they delayed planting, the temperature was too hot, and they got much less infection. That won't work for Illinois. And they also showed that the most severe disease was when the infection was within the first week after emergence. And that infection was mainly through the taproot and the lateral roots. In 2017, a Japanese group did some microscopy work, and they found that the root periderm is a very strong barrier to infection, and that most of the infection occurs during the seedling growth prior to the periderm formation, and at the root tips and sites of lateral root emergence, where the periderm is lacking. In 2017, that's when the disease was found in Illinois, in Pike County. And looking at the literature, this pathogen is found pretty much everywhere on various crops. I didn't see a reference for Africa, but I saw Asia, Southeast Asia, and Europe. And you'll see soybeans, peanuts, other legumes, papaya, eucalyptus, blueberry, holly. The scientist from Japan was saying that most of the infections on trees are in the seedling stage. They don't see late mature trees being infected. That's what I had for history. Carl?
Yeah, so we've got a map up here, kind of showing the more recent history, I guess, of red crown rot. So as Steve said, it's been in the U.S. for a while. It causes a rot on peanut in North Carolina, same pathogen. They worked on it in Louisiana. But in 2017, it showed up for the first time that we know of in Western Illinois in Pike County. Dr. Nathan Klacheski, formerly with University of Illinois, is the first one to have found that. And it got officially reported in 2018 in Pike County. And then there was a graduate student at U of I that was doing some scouting. And so a lot of that work is what you're seeing here when you see the counties in Illinois that's lit up. And that graduate student worked with people like Robert and others in the University of Illinois Plant Clinic to kind of map out this distribution for Illinois. We found it in Kentucky the first time in 2021, and you can see where it is in Kentucky. Graves County at first, and then Callaway County, which you maybe have heard of Murray. That's where Callaway is. So 2 counties that are right together. And then Darcy Talenko, who's a plant pathologist at Purdue University, started to find it in 2022 in a couple of counties, and then a couple more last year in 2023. And so it's in 4 counties in Indiana that she knows of as well. So, when I look at this map, I see a lot of gaps, right? Where you see red counties and then there's gaps between those red counties. I would think that red crown rot is probably filled in between some of those gaps and we just don't know it. And so that's why it's important for, why you're having the panel here today is to get the word out so that people can identify it and get samples sent to the appropriate diagnostic labs and figure out where it is. So this is where we know it's at, but it's probably in a lot more places than what you're seeing here on the map.
So earlier this year, it's funny how you get reunited with a lot of the people that I've worked with in a lot of different jobs in my past. One of my jobs was at the University of Illinois Plant Clinic, and that's where I was lucky enough to work with Carl there at U of I. And then earlier this year, I don't even know how so much has happened, but Steve called up and we ended up meeting, and he said that he was referred to me because you were looking for some red crown rot samples. And so we met, and I said, well, you really, really need to get in touch with Robert Bellm, who I used to work with at U of I Extension, and I had just been reunited with him at a field day. And he's like, I am already in touch with Robert. We have tons of samples from Madison County. So Steve, the USDA ARS has been doing research regarding genetic diversity of this pathogen. Can you share with us, what your work is and how this pathogen has changed now in Illinois?
Okay, we'll have to change some slides here. Let me go through here.
Oh, did I skip the question probably?
You want to go back?
You can go back.
Okay,
Sorry.
I'll talk to you later.
How can I forget Robert? I also want to let you know I did go to the eye doctor yesterday morning, and I am getting a new prescription for my bifocals. So Robert, again, I met you at a field day. We started talking about red crown rot. So you've been dealing with this disease for the past several years. Can you give us, share your experience, share some tips for scouting and what you've been seeing?
Well, Stephanie, I'm not sure I want to share my experience too much because this is not a disease you really want to have to run into. But I suspect it's out there a lot more widespread than we realize. Carl showed the map, and the gaps on that map, I think, need to be filled in. And that's going to require your help. I mean, you need to be able to identify this when you see it in the field and help fill out that state. If you look at scouting, this is not a disease that you can do from the windshield of your vehicle. I don't care if it's parked alongside the field. You can't do it through the windshield. My first exposure to this disease was in 2020, driving down the highway past a creek bottom field, looked out into it. I could see soybeans discoloring. This was about the 20th of August. Pulled in and walked out into the field, looked down, and I see these plants with interveinal chlorosis, necrosis going on. Pulled a couple of them up and said, darn, this is the worst case of Rhizoctonia co-infection I've ever seen in my life. And while I was there, I emailed Dr. Nathan Kluchewski, who was the U of I pathologist at the time, and said, by the way, just for your information, sudden death syndrome starting to show up in southern Illinois. And he responded to me pretty quickly and says, well, that's nice to know, but have you seen any red crown rot? And my answer back was, what in the heck is that? Had never seen it before. So I turned around and drove back to the field, walked in there and started pulling up plants, and this is what I saw. This is the first pictures of what I saw of red crown rot. And it's kind of the classic symptomology you see, the red lower stem, root area, some of the white mycelium. And if you look closely at that picture on the right, there are no parathecia on this plant. This was a relatively early infection. This is about as classic as it gets. I sent this picture to Nathan, and he responded back, yep, that's it. And that was kind of my introduction to red crown rot. Time of the year was relatively slow, so I had some scouting time, and I started just randomly going through our client list. This was in the Cahokia Creek bottom. So I started looking at fields downstream from this site, found it in 4 fields, 3 different growers, 4 different fields in that Cahokia Creek bottom in the fall of, or late summer of 2020. So that was kind of my introduction. But when you stood in this field looking down at the foliage, you'd say sudden death syndrome. And that's part of the problem with this disease. The foliar symptoms look exactly like sudden death syndrome. They look exactly like brown stem rot, look very similar to southern stem canker. It can look like triazole fungicide phytotoxicity on the leaves. A lot of different plants that, or a lot of different diseases that give you some similar symptomology. What are you playing with my slides there? So where are you at? You back me up.
I'm going to get in trouble.
Yeah, just keep your hands off of it. Okay, so, this is kind of what you see as the disease progresses. And again, this disease can be subtle. Early on, this picture was taken last summer, the 15th of July. Same field as what we had seen the earlier picture from 2 years later. So I went back to this field. I know it's infected with red crown rot. Walked into this spot. I'm walking through. Field looks perfectly clean. Except you'd find these scattered, isolated plants that are symptomatic, foliar symptomatic, and they are dying and melting into the canopy. From the road, you don't see it. This field looked perfectly healthy from the road, and until you started walking through and looking very carefully, spreading the canopy open, you could see these individual plants that are melting down, pull them up, and then the classic reddish discoloration on the base of the plant. Well, it doesn't stick to scattered plants. This is a field with a longer history of red crown rot, and as you can see, this can be quite extensive through a field. This was in 2023 on that one, so the disease can become relatively serious in any given field. Symptomology, how you might differentiate that from sudden death syndrome. Historically with sudden death syndrome, the plants become interveinal necrosis and chlorosis. Leaflets fall off the petioles. Petioles stay attached to the plant. With red crown rot, I typically find the leaves stay attached. And these things just kind of mat together and go down and lay down. And that kind of helps separate it from SDS. The problem is southern stem canker will do the exact same thing. So will anthracnose. It'll do the exact same thing. You've got to get into these fields, get down on your hands and knees, look at the base of the plants, pull them up, pull them up, pull them up. And you may pull up numerous plants before you start to find the symptomology. If you're in the middle of a highly infected area, kind of move to the outside edge of that area, that transition zone, to see more obvious symptomology. As the season progresses, the symptomology changes. It's very much different towards the end of the season. This is sort of a progression from left to right and then top to bottom throughout the season. And Pretty soon you will see the parathecia present, hopefully. Be carrying a hand lens with you. It's not always obvious. As that plant starts to degrade, the parathecia may start to disappear. And by the middle of September, you're probably done. These plants have degraded so bad that you start to understand why in peanut it's called black rot. These plants just literally decay. When you go into a symptomatic field, you don't have to grab a plant with 2 hands. You can grab it with 2 fingers and pull it out of the ground. The roots are totally decayed at that point. It's not quite that simple. There are some Luke-like diseases again, sudden death syndrome. Foliarly looks very similar. However, the roots don't have that reddish discoloration. Which one's that one, Steve? I can't.
Stem canker and phytophthora.
Yeah, stem canker and phytophthora. Again, you know, a lot of things will cause plants to turn brown and defoliate in the fall. Phytophthora certainly can. Charcoal rot can. Southern stem canker can. And look very similar, but again, you don't see the root problems with that. And then we get these co-infections occurring that really complicate the situation to where you can have both red crown rot and like southern stem canker in a plant. When this occurs, these plants die early. I mean, these will be totally non-productive plants, won't set seed. You can get co-infection with things like anthracnose or even several other stem diseases. Again, you'll find both the parathecia on the plant and other symptomology. And what's that one? SDS. Yeah, SDS and red crown rot. That's the one that'll make you scratch your head. You know, you pull it up and yeah, there's the parathecia. Oh, here's this blue mycelium also. So you got co-infections going on. It gets frustrating. Sometimes you'll find SDS by itself. I looked at 5 fields in a row early this summer. Red crown rot, red crown rot, red crown rot. I get to the 5th field and go, yeah, it's going to be red crown rot. Walk in, all sudden death syndrome. So do not assume. Keep your head on straight.
Okay, now back to genetic diversity. So again, Steve came to the ISA to help get some samples. We tried to get the word out. We hope to maybe be more coordinated this year. But the best part was we coordinated to get samples to run through the U of I plant clinic, but you were able to give some funding to pay for the samples this year. I don't know, you can speak for the next year. I don't want to put you on the spot, but based on those samples that you received, what's some of the research you're doing, and what are some of the things that you're finding?
Yeah, so we're trying to characterize the genetic diversity. Like, is this like one isolate that just took over, or is it multiple isolates? And then, that'll tell us something about the history of the disease. Yeah, people have samples. We'd love to have them. And if you want us to pay for shipping, we can manage that also. I can coordinate with Stephanie on how to do that. Or going through the U of I disease clinic. So we surveyed plants from across central and southern Illinois. Initially it was with Robert, and then we did a little bit of scouting on our own. We had a hard time finding any. Of all the scouting that I did personally, me and my technician Teresa, we found one field. It was just east of Decatur. Most of the samples that we had then all came from growers. We found some from Bond, Gallatin, Macoupin, Madison, Pyatt, Pike, Shelby, all having positive red crown rot. And then we also got some from Carl from Kentucky, which you showed on the map there. So we extracted DNA from 40 isolates in 2022, and another, now it's like 26 or 27 from 23. We're still in the process of finishing up the samples from 23. We PCR'd 6 different target regions that others have shown to be good for doing the genetic analyses. So you do you re-amplify those targets, do the sequence, and then compare those sequences to look for any differences. And so far we found 2 closely related isolates in Illinois. We can just call one isolate 1, one isolate 2. So one we found only in Pike County, and that's all we found in Pike County was this one isolate. And then the other locations, Madison and everywhere else, all had the same genetic characteristics for these 6 different regions. We haven't done the Gallatin one yet, but we will soon. And all the Illinois isolates seem to be fairly different from the isolates that were in the repositories, like at the NRL in Peoria and in the ATCC collection, where people can submit microbes. So those came from peanut, blueberry, and soybean from Georgia, North Carolina, and Louisiana. So those are all those look different from the ones we're finding in Illinois. And this gives a summary of how we found these, or what we found so far. So you can see the colors there. So the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, those all have the same genotype, we would say. And those are all from Illinois, Bond, Macoupin, Madison, Piatt, Shelby counties. And we have, I don't know, over 40, 50 samples from their isolates. And then if you look at the ones from Pike County, the next three, they all have one difference in the ITS region, but it's consistent. So now we have 6 different isolates from Pike. They're all the same, and from 2023. And we have the original one from Nathan from 2018. And then we had some more that were in the lab. So anyways, we have, I think we have maybe 7 now from Pike County, and then they're all the same. What was interesting too was that Carl's from Graves County, Kentucky, that's the next line. We had 3 different samples so far from there. They all matched the ones from Pike County. So it looks like from the samples we got from 2022 and 2023, Pike County had its own isolate, but it matched the ones from Kentucky. And then everywhere else in Illinois where we found them were like the ones in Madison County. And then at the very bottom, you can see the ones that came from the collections from 1988, 1970, 1974, that came from other states, off other plants. Those all were consistent among that group, but they're all different from the ones that we're finding. So, I'm not really sure how we interpret this. One thing we can say is that it's not the same one that was on the peanut, back a couple decades ago. This is just to show how we actually know these things exist. So when you do the sequencing, you get these chromatograms, and you can see the top row, that one section there, the whole sequence would have been the same for hundreds of bases. And then there's one section, you have 7 Ts. This is what we saw in the isolate from Madison County and everywhere else. But then the ones from Pike County had 8 Ts there. So we got 1 extra base inserted. That's a mutation or some kind of genetic change. Then the ones from the peanuts and elsewhere from decades ago, they all have a rather different sequence in that region, where they have a TA and then 4 Ts. So that's how we identify the differences. I'm not sure what else to say about that. Okay.
Thank you so much. Carl, so you've been doing some seed treatment trials, and so can you share with everyone what are you learning from those and any information?
Yeah, thank you. We have had an opportunity to do some field trials the last 2 years looking at fungicide seed treatments. It makes sense that fungicide seed treatments might be a way to help manage this disease because of the early infection that would happen in the young seedling roots. So it might make sense to have a fungicide there that could help provide some protection. There was some greenhouse/growth chamber work that Nathan Klacheski had done, showing in the growth chamber that there was some efficacy from Saltro seed treatment, and then some not quite as great of efficacy, but some efficacy from Illevo seed treatment. And what those 2 seed treatments have in common is they're both from the same chemistry class. We call those the SDHI fungicides. So we had a field trial that we conducted in 2022 and 2023 where we tried to look at a whole bunch of SDHI fungicide seed treatments. So rather than look at a bunch of different chemistry classes, we just looked at one chemistry class and different active ingredients. So that's what you're looking at here. And so 2022 data are on the left, 2023 are on the right. So right off, and these are on the same scale, so right off you're going to see that we really didn't have very much disease in 2023. Where this trial was conducted, it was very, very dry in that area, and so we just didn't have a lot of disease develop. So everything I say, I'm going to couch by saying what you're really kind of looking at here is 1 year of data, right? And so we all know that to have a good, robust field trial, that you really have to have that at different environments or different years. And so we're going to continue this work, and we'll see if we see the same kind of results in 2024 and maybe 2025. But what you're looking at there, each bar represents a different seed treatment. You probably can't read those, so I'll read it. On the far left is just an untreated. Actually, that's not completely untreated. That was, well, no, we did have an untreated. I'm sorry, that was completely untreated. And then we had a base. So that base was just a kind of a normal fungicide. I think it was Trilex 2000 is what we were looking at. And that it would not have any control, really, we wouldn't think, of red crown rot. And that base is on all the other treatments. So everything you see past that's going to have that base plus whatever's listed there. So the next one's Illevo, the next one is Saltro, then Vibrance, and Cystivia, I think. I can't pronounce that word. So all those are SDHI fungicide seed treatments that are registered on soybean. So as you look at that, the higher the bar, the more disease. One of the things that you're really probably already noticing is that one of those treatments has quite a bit more disease than the base or the untreated, right? And so in our studies, we did see with Illevo that we actually increased disease severity. And we don't know how often that happens. We don't know if that was just this happened one time in this particular field because we didn't have a whole lot of disease the second year. But certainly it makes you question a little bit if you know, there may be something going on there. The other thing you see is not always statistically significant, but we did see some reduction when you compare it to the untreated with some of those treatments. And one of those that had reduced it the most is Saltro seed treatment. Syngenta in early 2023, they make Saltro seed treatment. They added red crown rot to their label. So right now, that's the only product that has red crown rot on its label, and they labeled it as suppression. And what we've seen, and I'll show a little bit more data from an on-farm trial that we had in Kentucky as well, but what we've seen with that is we are seeing a reduction with disease, but it's not a silver bullet. So it's not, you know, if you're going to have red crown rot, you're probably still going to have red crown rot, but it looks like maybe it's a delaying infection or reducing infection. And then the other trial that we had was a planting date trial along with Illevo seed treatment. So it was with or without Illevo at different planting dates. And the reason we put this trial together is in Graves County, Kentucky, there's a lot of double crop soybeans. We have full season and double crop soybeans all together, all in the same area, and all in the same area of that county that has red crown rot. One of the things we've noticed in Kentucky, but Robert is not necessarily seeing this in Illinois, if I understand correctly, but at least so far in Kentucky, one of the things that we've seen is that it seems like it's always a little bit worse in our double crop soybeans compared to our full season soybeans that are planted in the same area. And we can find it in full season, but it's just the effect of the disease it seems like it's a lot worse in our double crop. And some things kind of make sense that way because we talked about the soil temperature, 77 to 86 degrees is sort of like its range that it really likes, this fungus likes for infection. And if you're planting in April, you know, you're going to be much lower soil temperatures than that. And so, you know, probably June, July, when we're planting double crop soybeans, that's when those soil temperatures, at least in Kentucky, would be getting to kind of that range. And so some of that kind of makes sense. So when we did this trial, if you focus on the left, again, that's 2022 data. And I just want you to block out that blue bar for the moment, okay? Just look at the black bars. And that's the untreated. And do you see an effect of planting date when you just look at the black bars on the left? Yeah? Do you see that trend? So in April, there's, you know, here's April right here, right? So a little bit of disease. May, a little bit more. June, quite a bit more. So in 2022, that sort of matched what we saw, what we've been seeing in Graves County, Kentucky. Now, we added the Illevo in on this as well, and so we're seeing just a really weird interaction between planting date and seed treatment. So in April and May, Illevo, which are the blue bars, actually made disease worse, but when we planted in June, we saw a reduction in disease compared to the untreated. So along with that data, and then looking in the 2023 data next to it, which we didn't have as much disease, but we still did see sort of that trend with Illevo, we do think that there's probably something going on there, and it is something that we need to dig into a little bit more. For whatever reason, in our April and May planting dates, things kind of went the opposite direction, and so we need to better understand that. We probably have more questions than answers right now about all of that. And then finally, we had an on-farm study with some farmers in Kentucky where they would split their planter with a base treatment and then Saltro. One field had Saltro at the kind of the normal use rate, which is 0.075 milligrams per something. I don't remember what the unit is. And then Syngenta recently changed their label where they could go up to 0.15. And so we looked at both rates there. And of course, on these field scale trials with a very patchy disease, Robert kind of talked about, initially it can be very patchy, right? And so when you're trying to do research, sometimes you may not have disease, but it may not have anything to do with the seed treatment. It just may be that pathogen's not present there. So it's a little hard doing this work. So we've got a lot of drone images that we're still trying to dig into to kind of maybe cut out pieces of the field where we can kind of align more with where we had high disease pressure and look at these yield responses. But overall, from the entire field, which we had patches where we had red crown rot and didn't, we did see some yield differences. In one field, it was about a 9.4 bushel an acre yield response between the base and the Saltro, and the other, it was 7.7 bushels an acre. So again, we still had disease present where Saltro was, but it does seem to provide at least some suppression, which is currently the only registered tool that we have at the moment.
So one of the most common questions we think of with diseases, sometimes we can have resistance or different tolerances within varieties. So I will pass it off to Steve. Based on preliminary screening of soybean PIs at the greenhouse at U of I, can you share with us, based on what you've seen and your experiments there?
Okay. Yeah, so for screening, it's a little bit tricky because they just trying to set it up, trying to get the right amount of fungus in the soil for inoculation. So we've been following what the Japanese group has published and then talking to this Japanese researcher, Dr. Oshii, giving some advice from him. And we've gone through, this is our set of germplasm we're starting with. So I mentioned we try to get the ancestral lines for the ancestral lines to the U.S. germplasm. And then we also tried some varieties or cultivars or PIs that we know has some resistance to other pathogens, like maybe some resistance to SDS or something. And then a group in Missouri from Hen Nguyen's group, they sequenced 450 that they determined to be genetically quite diverse within the whole USDA collection of soybean. And then after that, we'll do the soja and perennials if we need to. So right now, we've only gone through that first set of some of the ancestrals. We've gone through just under 200 plants. And again, this is the very first screening. So Teresa, who was doing this work, feels like she needs to still optimize her screening method a little bit better. But doing all these reps that she's already done, she's got some ideas on how to try to tweak the system, make it a little bit better. But you can see on the left the non-infected and the right, inoculated, non-inoculated. So these seedlings get pretty toasted. And one of the things that she was thinking that maybe she had too high of an inoculation level. So next round she's going to cut that in half. But everything been getting infected so far. The one thing we did see that the Japanese group had said that this cultivar called Enray had some resistance. Talking to Dr. Oshii, he was saying that it's like pretty marginal, not that great, but you do see a difference that's kind of consistent. And Teresa said the same thing. She said it does seem like it has some difference compared to the others, but it's just not really strong. So we're going to continue that, and hopefully we'll find something that has something that's kind of strong that can be helpful, beneficial. Teresa also looked at corn, because that's one of the common questions, for doing crop rotation. And the Japanese group had published that his corn was not affected. And with Teresa's studies, it seems to be the same. We did not do any kind of specific, PCR or infected tissue or something like that. Because maybe there's some fungus inside, but anyways, we don't see any major difference. It looks like it's not a host, like the Japanese group had said. So there's potential to have maize as a crop rotation, but then again, I don't know how it's going to affect the soil in the field, so that's got to be tested. But at least in the lab, it looks like it's not a host.
While we're on this subject, Robert, have you seen any differences out in the field when you're looking at different varieties, or do you have any information on that?
I haven't seen anything. I'm a field agronomist for a Pioneer seed dealer. I'm looking at primarily at Pioneer varieties, although our client base plants others. I don't know any particular. Whenever I walk into a field, I don't know whether it's our soybeans or some other companies, but really have not seen any difference. I know I was reading the paper out of Louisiana back in the early 1990s that was indicating there was some varietal differences in their trials down there, but the general comment was the group 7 varieties were less susceptible than maybe the group 5s and 6s, but they didn't really expand anymore. But if the shorter season varieties were more susceptible as we move north, that doesn't bode well for us.
Yeah, so some of those varieties that were shown, like in the Louisiana studies, Teresa has those in hers, and so far they haven't shown any strong differences. So, anyways, all this stuff, we're in the early stages of screening, and we'll have to do a lot more screening to hopefully find something. But we are trying to take different varieties that other papers have shown to maybe have some resistance in their trials. And the ones in Louisiana were also field studies, I think, where ours are all greenhouse, so that's a big difference there.
Thank you. We'll start with you, Robert. How have farmers or you been managing this disease, and everybody can comment on this too, what kind of yield losses are they experiencing?
Well, yield losses are going to depend upon, again, the severity and infection, the incidence, as well as the severity in the field. When it first comes into a field, it tends to be relatively isolated. From a scouting standpoint, if you know you have an infected field and you want to scout, I would start scouting next in any other fields that are managed by that grower, because it's going to spread by spreading soil and tillage. Severely infected fields are areas where the infection level is high, the yield is 0. I mean, it kills these plants before they ever set a viable seed. Later infections will yield almost normally, but overall I've seen yield losses probably as high as 25% on a field average, but that would be a pretty heavily infested field.
I can just mention a little bit, and really what Robert said is very true, because it just really depends on the size of the patches and how many patches there are, but what some of the work that we've done at a very small scale, going into fields and basically sampling plants that are in the middle of a dead patch, and then going a few feet over and sampling non-symptomatic plants, and then measuring yield on those plants, basically. And what we've seen is up to about a 70% yield reduction from kind of a almost worst case scenario to a very healthy plant. Now, that only, in overall, in the entire field, that's really what matters. And it really just depends on how big those patches are. But we do know as those patches grow over time, that yield loss will be worse and worse on a field basis.
Yeah, this was a field in Pike County. I'm pretty sure now I understand where we are. So anyways, coming down here, it was kind of interesting that you can see the really, heavily infected fields here. When we got down here to the bottom of the hill, there's a line here which made the grower wonder why there's a strong line in these areas here. We don't have good answers for that. But some growers have mentioned that. They'll wonder, like, why is, one field, hit heavily, but then just next to it, that field is not. Maybe the next season it will be. Just don't know what to say. If you guys have anything to say about that?
All right, before we open it up for questions, any of you can comment, but I'll direct it towards Carl now. What are the general recommendations that you have been giving farmers for this disease?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's still a lot of awareness that we need to build, and so it's good to have these kind of things to help build awareness because, number one, you have to identify that you have it or not. That's the number one thing. So sample, get those samples in to whatever lab. If you're here in Illinois, U of I Plant Clinic or Steve's lab or wherever, through Stephanie, whoever. So identification's number one. Then crop rotation, we need to continue crop rotation. That's good, showing that corn doesn't appear to be a host. So being sure that we keep those crop rotations. Continuous soybean would likely increase inoculum and make things worse. Then the only seed treatment that we currently have that's registered is Saltro. So if you have red crown rot in your field, you might want to consider that. I've been talking to my farmers about the risk and double crop, et cetera, but we're still kind of uncertain if that applies everywhere, and that could be maybe some of those differences in isolates, genetic variability that Steve is finding. And I think limiting spread is also important. If you're in a field that has red crown rot, one of the ways that it's going to move is however that soil moves. So I know it's not easy to clean off equipment, but that might help reduce or slow down the spread to a new field, so that's also important. Managing other stresses is also important. There was some work, again, at LSU in the either 80s or 90s looking at interactions with soybean cyst nematode, and they did find that where soybean cyst nematode was present, red crown rot was more severe compared to where only red crown rot was present. So avoiding stresses, I know ISA is supporting a lot of free SCN testing, I think. So, going out and sampling fields for soybean cyst nematode and managing soybean cyst nematode might help you just maybe take a half step or so towards managing red crown rot as well. So I think those are probably the main things.
I did have notes. So I know one thing that Matt Montgomery's mentioned previously that I listened to one of his videos, drainage. He had mentioned that. And then common question that we keep getting is, does fungicide help? And your answer would be no, right?
Like foliar fungicide? Yeah, it's not likely because it's a pathogen that's in the soil and it's infecting the roots. When we think about the foliar fungicides that we have, some of them are systemic, but they only move through the xylem if they're systemic. So that means up. They're not moving down. So I'd say it's unlikely that we would be getting protection where we need it. Possibly in furrow applications, that's one of the things we want to start looking at. In drainage, you're right. I think if you have some areas in your field that hold moisture for a longer period of time, those are probably the areas where you might see red crown rot first. Robert, you've been walking a lot of fields. Are you seeing that too?
What's bothered me all about this all along, Carl, is how it enters an area to begin with. This is a soil-borne organism, and once it's on your operation, you're going to move it from field to field pretty quickly through tillage. Anything that moves soil is going to move this disease around an operation. But then you get this hop and skip and jump. It'll show up in the middle of a field in a totally different operation or a totally different county, and you wonder how it got there. And we don't have the answer to that. The frustration of this disease is we've got more questions than we do answers. And I kind of reflect back. This is kind of where we were with cyst nematode and sudden death syndrome 40 years ago. It was kind of the stigma of you got it, and and how did you get it? It's a social disease or whatever, and nobody wants to talk about it. if we bury our head in the sand, this disease is going to bury us pretty quickly. And there's this sort of this attitude of, well, it's not on my operation, it's not even in my county, I don't have to worry about it. I suspect it's, as we said earlier, it's more widespread and it's causing more damage than we realize. I've got fields that are 60, 70, 80 acres that are 100% infested. This did not happen overnight. This disease has been in those fields for a number of years to be that widespread. So, you know, how widespread is it really? And that's where we're depending on you to get out and look. Start scouting about late R3, early R4. So you're going to be looking at mid-July, 1st of August is when this disease is probably going to start showing up. And you can kind of do your windshield survey, and if you see discoloration going on in a field, stop, get out, walk into the area, and look closely. And if you identify it in one field and one operation, start going to other fields within that operation and start where the equipment enters the field and look there first. And then you're still going to find these random spots in random fields, and you go, how did it get here? And we don't know.
So one last question for all of us, really all of us. I'm looking at the new U of I plant pathologist right now, Dr. Boris Camilletti. I think, I'm referencing back to my eye appointment yesterday. Is that Dr. Nathan Schroeder in the back? Yes. He's the nematologist at U of I. So what's next? What projects can ISA help you with? What are we going to do going forward? Robert, what would you recommend? I'll let you start off.
Well, my mission, I think, in the last 4 years is to increase awareness of this disease. We need to conduct research on it. Research requires money. Money doesn't come across, whether it goes to a university or anybody else, unless there's a perceived need. And as long as this is just a small little minor problem over in this county, there's no money. So we need funding for Carl, for Steve, for Boris, and anybody else, Dr. Bond down at SIU, funding to do research to find out how to manage this disease. Because if we don't, it's going to blow up in our faces, I'm afraid.
I wanted to make one more comment on the maize as not being a host and crop rotation. So I don't know if anybody's done any studies, if you guys see any studies, like how many years do you need to have corn? Is it just 1 year or 2 or 3? So that I'm not saying, because I don't know if you guys know. But so the Japanese group found for the with soybean and rice, they had a 2-year rotation with the rice. But you know, that's in Japan where they grow soybean and rice paddies. So it's totally different. So that study needs to be done by somebody. Right now, we don't really know how many years you need to have corn to really minimize the disease of soybean afterwards.
I mean, we do like corn, but we'd rather you grow soybeans. So this is why this is so important, right? What, Carl, any suggestions? Or?
Yeah, well, I think there's a whole lot of research that needs to be conducted, and management practices have changed over the last several years. We see a lot more cover crops now than we used to, and it'd be interesting to see what kind of effect cover crops may have, either good or bad, or maybe no effect on diseases like this. And I think it's a lot of the work that's starting, looking at germplasm screening. That's resistant varieties. That's always the first line of defense. And so we need varieties that have some level of resistance. We'll continue to look at fungicides as well, either seed treatment or in furrow. But all this takes work and takes time, and it's good to have a new plant pathologist at Illinois that's going to be doing some of this work. And others are interested as this disease is showing up in new states. We're trying to build a team to try to answer a lot of these questions. One thing I don't know if you saw, we have like a fake red crown rot plant that's in the back corner back there. So if you haven't seen red crown rot, it looks pretty much like that. That's not a real plant, but it looks like that. So you can focus on the foliar symptoms, and then you can also see the symptoms on the root. So be sure you look at that before you leave too.
And also, ISA is interested in doing joint projects with nearby states as well. So I'll open it up for questions to the audience now. Are there any questions?
I'll answer that. So I mean, I could email it to you if you want to send me an email, but we are working on a more, if you notice it said unofficial map, we are working on an official map. So some of you are probably aware of tar spot of corn and using the EDD maps system to do that. We're using the exact same system to work on mapping red crown rot. We just kind of got it started, and we have a few observations that are on there, but not everybody's uploaded their information yet. So there will soon, hopefully, be a more public map that will be available. We don't have all the data on it yet.
Good question. Any others? Pam?
Once you've seen it in a field, Robert, does it ever, I mean, what does it look like the next time?
Hey, Robert, can you repeat her question for online?
The question is, once you've found it in a field, you know, does it change over time? Yeah, it spreads. So, you know, as I'm now in the four growing seasons of looking at this thing. I started out with 4 fields in 2020. I'm now up to 40 fields within the area that I work. In the fields where we found it originally, it's continuing to spread. I've got some fields that are 100% infested, so I suspect they've been infested for a number of years and was being misdiagnosed. So, yeah, it continues to get worse. Carl had commented in Kentucky it tends to be worse in the double crops. If I have found it in full season beans, and I'm in an area where they grow a lot of wheat and double crop, if I have found it in full season beans, I will find it in that same spot in double crop beans. But for me, it doesn't seem to be as severe in the double crops as it is in full season beans. As far as the severity of the infection, the earlier the plant is infected, or at the higher level that it's infected, the worse the yield is for that plant. So beans that are showing symptomatic infection on the foliage at late R3 will be totally non-productive. Some may not show foliar symptoms until R6, and those will yield probably somewhat less than what they would have if they'd been uninfected. So you see this range within a field. It's really kind of a head scratcher, and I don't know if the difference is timing of infection, if it's the amount of inoculum any individual plant encountered at the time of infection, or whether it's co-infection again with things like southern stem canker, so the two are additive on the plant. But again, I mean, the symptomology is pretty obvious once you get used to looking at it, but yeah, pull a lot of plants, carry a hand lens, look for the parathecia. The parathecia are a positive diagnostic sign. Whereas the red stem, you know, you could mistake that for some other things once in a while.
And since it moves on soil, could it also move on equipment, I'm assuming?
Anything that would move soil from in an infected field, anything that moves soil can theoretically move the disease.
Okay, any other questions? Yeah.
For red crown rot, are you seeing multiple infection cycles throughout one growing season, or is it just a one-shot?
So I'll repeat the question, and then Steve will answer it. So you asked about multiple growing.
This is why we have a panel.
Multiple disease cycles within a growing season. I can take a stab at that. I don't really know the answer, but I have an idea. So I would probably consider this what we'd call like a monocyclic disease, because you're really just going to have one infection on the plant. I would imagine, since you got parathecia and I'm sure canidia, you've got reproduction of the pathogen in some sense. It's probably happening, but I would imagine that you just have a one-time infection, and once that infection happens, it's infecting that plant, and then all these other plants are getting infected on their own. You're probably not getting plant-to-plant spread, but we don't really know all that. But just sort of based on being the nature of a soil-borne pathogen, that's what I would That's what I'm telling you. It may not be right.
Yeah, I would agree with that. As far as can you have like multiple infections in a plant in a given season? We won't really know. We can't really tell if it's happening or not. But it seems that you can have a really early infection, which is before that suberin layer gets deposited around the roots. So that's when plants are really susceptible. And so a seed treatment should ideally help for that. So if you can avoid that initial infection, it's much better off. And it could be that a plant gets infected there and pathogen grows slowly, and then later somewhere else on the root you get another infection, but you wouldn't know that. It'd be hard to tell. But I think the more you can do to avoid that initial infection in the seedling stage, the more likely you're going to have something come out of the plant.
So the question is, would the deterioration of the plant be the first thing that you would look for to identify it, or is there something earlier? Robert has a lot of experience on it. I'll again take my shot first, I guess. What I've noticed is the first symptom that I've been able to see would be that reddish discoloration that you can see on the lower stem, and if you happen to dig up that plant or pull that plant up, you can find it there. However, I'll say that the only reason I know that is because these are fields that I knew had red crown rot, and so I went out and started looking. There was not really anything above ground that would have led me to those plants. So, really not until you start to see those foliar symptoms is probably when it becomes noticeable with the naked eye, at least.
I think, since infection occurs very early in the plant's life, I suspect there is some damping off occurring on small plants. The trouble is there are Pythium, Phytophthora, Rhizoctonia, Fusarium, all cause damping off. So there's no visual difference that I can see as a scout, to differentiate those diseases from each other. I go into fields that have a broad spectrum seed treatment fungicide on them, and I see damping off. Is it red crown rot or some other disease? I don't know. My first symptomology I see is going to be that interveinal necrosis, chlorosis, and then start pulling plants at that point.
Any last questions? Go ahead. I have to ask, are you a plant pathology student? I had to do it. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know what's, it's just something that's on the radar for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Well, I know it is as far as, we're funded for it. I can't speak for,
We can't comment on the,
Yeah.
we can't comment on the state.
Yeah, I work for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and they're funding me to work on this. So it's on their radar. They know about it. When we started, they call it a 5-year plan. We write a proposal. It's like an internal proposal. Glenn Hartman, a former plant pathologist at the University of Illinois with USDA, he's like the world expert on soybean diseases. He told me that this is popping up here and there, not very much, like Robert was saying, mainly in his fields, maybe in Pike County. He said, we don't know if it's going to be a big disease or not. It might fade away, be nothing. We don't really know. And that was like 3 years ago or 2 years ago. And now it's really expanding. So the USDA definitely knows about it. And we do have funding right now, at least in my group. I'm not aware off the top of my head what other groups might also be working on it, but they definitely know about it.
I'm going to go ahead and conclude this session. Are you all able to stick around for questions? Okay. So thank you so much to all of you for coming here and doing the panel. If you are a CCA attending in person, please do not forget to claim your CCEU credits for the session. Sign-ups for the CEUs are near the registration table in the main hall. If you are attending online, please read the CEU instructions in the chat. We aren't done for the day, so if you want to head back to Heritage Hall for a happy hour and share in all the fun of our student research poster competition. So thank you so much for attending.